Hello everyone. Sorry for the slight delay. I had still a few ongoing issues because I thought, well, let's have a little cycling bit of naval artwork going on in the background. As you can see, I think on the screen is your left and is to my right, with this little digital photo frame that was very kindly sent to me, but. For some reason I cannot fathom. To me, it looks perfectly fine. On the screen, it seems to be hilariously washed out. And I've tried closing the curtains. It's not the sunlight. I've tried turning off the main light. It's not that. I don't know what's going on there. So, anyway, welcome. As you know, this is the mid-month live stream. So we will be just taking questions from the chat straight off. So Michael O'Brien has led off with, in Operation Rheinebung, Yamato replaces Bismarck. How does Yamato stand up assuming major events remain the same, i.e. hood sinking and a broken rudder? Well, I mean, if hood has been sunk and the Swordfish have somehow landed a torpedo strike that's broken Yamato's rudder, events are probably going to play out roughly the same, because it's just going to take a bit longer. Because if its rudder is broken, okay, Yamato, it can do a bit more steering than Bismarck can using its propellers, but that's not really going to help it tremendously. It's not going to have any much more luck, to be honest, in terms. I mean, obviously it depends also on what version of Yamato. If we're talking as early form is Yamato can get close to 1941, so we're talking about Yamato that's mainly got the 4 triple 6-inch turrets rather than the extensive AA battery it would have later. But assuming that everything goes exactly the same as with Bismarck up to the point of the rudder breaking, it's probably going to get overhauled by King George V and Rodney, the same as Bismarck did, because of the steering issues. And then, I mean, Bismarck did a fairly creditable job of its gunnery for the situation it was in, being slowed down and somewhat wallowing. But, as I've said before, one of Rodney's first hits was the hit that took out Bismarck's primary fire control. And, okay, Yamato's turrets have more, have bigger rangefinders on them, but without the primary fire control, its accuracy is going to suffer. The one bit of variation where you're probably looking at is obviously Rodney and King George V, in relatively short order once the fire control is out, dismantle Bismarck in terms of its main armament. Famously, Rodney sends a 16-inch shell straight through the front of the face of Bruno turret, blows out the back, and that's it for Bruno. And Anton turrets also disabled in pretty short order, and they work their way around. Now, if Yamato's got its 18-inch turrets facing towards Rodney's shells are not going to go through that faceplate. But the flip side to that is that it's not going to go. It's not going to go through and kill everyone inside. It may well still disable the turret, because it'll go a certain distance in before exploding, so that may disable the turret. It might not. So Yamato might stand more of a chance thereafter to score some hits, but it is going to be operating under local fire control with its local turrets. If the British appreciate what kind of a threat Yamato is in terms of its size and firepower, then the airstrike from Ark Royal that spent most of the time circling above will probably just go in anyway, or be sent in before the battleships move in to try and finish it off. So, yeah, there's a possibility that Yamato inflicts more damage using local fire control if the turrets manage to stay operational for a bit longer. But it is a bit of a long shot. It'll obviously take a bit longer to kill Yamato as well, but they hit it with enough torpedoes and it'll go down. It's really that main loss of primary fire control early on that's going to be the spanner in the works. Without that, if its fire control remains intact, there's much more possibility of, obviously, Yamato is fighting the kind of odds that it was designed to fight in, even if not necessarily in ideal conditions because of the problems with the rudder. yeah, if that fire control stays in place, then they've got a lot better chance. If not, then, you know, losing that is a pretty important issue. Right, so there we go. So Knight 6831 asks, could HMS Indefatigable and HMS Implacable have been rebuilt, and how similar to Victorious would they be? In theory, yes, they could have been. Similar to Victorious, well, the Implacables are slightly larger than the Illustriouses to start with, so... And, you know, Victorious's refit was a complete and utter shambles, so hopefully not too similar. Looks-wise, though, I suspect they probably would have ended up looking similar, just somewhat larger. But, yeah, the short version is, yes, they could be rebuilt. Yes, it would cost less than Victorious, but then pretty much any aircraft carrier refit of that period was going to cost less than Victorious because of the complete mess they made of it. But whether or not it would have been particularly useful is another matter entirely, because, again, limited hangar heights. They are better ships than the Illustriouses, but for the modern jet era, it's difficult to see them having much of a place for any extended period of time. I am the Phoenix. Will the Franklin expedition get a Wednesday video? Yeah, at some point. Colin Cameron. My grandfather served aboard Ajax as a Marine and borrowed one of the spare lenses for the gun aiming system to use as a magnifying glass. How common was that sort of thing? Borrowing from either your ship or other people's ships is a long and proud tradition in the Royal Navy. So, yeah. Specifically taking bits out of the gun aiming system, I think is probably a little bit rarer. But in terms of generally acquiring bits of the ship for your own personal use in some way, shape or form, yeah, I'm going to say that's not uncommon on Royal Navy ships. I mean, the British Armed Forces in general do have something of a habit of taking everything that isn't bolted down, and if they've got a bit of time, they'll unbolt and the stuff that is. If you give me a second. That's right, Mrs. Drack is just going to make sure to reactivate my screen. So I will keep talking while she does that in the background. Redneck Fury asks, air conditioning was mentioned in the Iowa captain interview. What, to your knowledge, is the first warship with air conditioning implemented in its construction phase, and how common was it to retrofit ships with air conditioning? It depends on how you define air conditioning. So, if you define air conditioning as the circulation of air of a different temperature through the ship, then that was actually pretty early. That would have been in the, I want to say probably the 1870s or somewhere thereabout. Yeah, because in large part it started off as a way of increasing the pressure in the boiler rooms to get more power out of the engines. So that's kind of air circulation, taking cooler air and pumping it into an area where you want either more air pressure or more air. And apparently today's the day for the police helicopter to come over. Well, I didn't do anything, so it's not my problem. Anyway, so yeah, as far as air conditioning, circulation of air specifically for crew comfort, that came about towards the end of the 19th century in the late 1880s, early 1890s for ships that were designed to go on foreign stations, albeit in a somewhat limited capacity, and you start to see it become more and more prevalent through the 1900s into the lead up of World War I. HMS Hood famously had quite a considerable amount of air circulation built into her design, specifically because she was such a big hull and they were expecting it to go into tropical waters, albeit that from all accounts it doesn't seem to have worked very well on occasion, although part of that may have been also because of the amount of water she took aboard, both over her quarterdeck and occasionally over the bow. If by aircon you mean very specifically aircon in the sense of, how do I put this, where you have like you'd have today, where you'd have an active cooling matrix to take heat out of the existing air and then push it back through the ship as cooled air. That much I don't know for certain, but I would guess probably in the interwar period. Ralak said, "Is naval artwork getting slightly better, or is it just me?" Well, not that I'm a particular art critic, but if, in my view at least, I think with naval artwork, there, as I'm given to understand, happens a lot with art, it somewhat moves in phases. So you have, well, you've got sort of a lot of the Napoleonic era naval art is trying to be as close to real life as they can, with some artistic license taken. And then you have a period in the early to mid 20th century where there is some realistic naval art, but there's a lot more abstract stuff. And then as you get closer towards now, you start to see some naval art trending back towards a more realistic representation of things. So yeah, I think it's partly just a trend in art, but that's the kind of world where I only have the very sort of paddling pool level of understanding of where trends go. I know that they exist, and I know roughly in very, very broad terms where those trends go, but that's really about it. Josh Thomas Moore asks, what issues did carriers have in the North Sea and the Arctic? Well, in the Arctic, you have problems with ice build-up, which is obviously a major problem. But more generally, when you're talking about the North Sea and the Arctic in terms of sea conditions, there are violent waves and storms quite commonly. You do get those. You do get storms and such in the Pacific as well. I'm just trying to see if I've got a random ship floating around nearby. Not within arm's reach that I'd be happy with picking up without knocking everything over. So you just have to bear with me. But yeah. So what can we use? I sent all the bottles away. Oh well, we'll use this D7. The Klingon Empire can be good for something. Right, so let's say we've got our D7, which is standing in for the role of an aircraft carrier in the North Sea. So in the Pacific, you have stuff. You have waves generally which have a very long wavelength. Now, obviously, wavelength of waves can vary according to each ocean and each sea, just dependent on weather conditions and stuff. This is just more general trends. But, so, with this ship, you've got the length of the ship. Now, if the wavelength of the wave is considerably more than the length of the ship, which is more common in very large oceans like the Pacific, then at any given point where the ship is on that wave, you don't tend to have too much of an angle. So if, let's say, for sake of argument, the ship is 300 meters or 250 meters, so roughly 800, 900 foot long. If the wavelength is, say, a kilometer, so roughly 3 to 4 times the ship's length, then the ship is kind of going to look like this as it goes up and down on the wave. So there'll be a fair bit of vertical motion, but at no point is there a significant amount of pitch, except for maybe just as it crests the top of the wave, because the slope is twice the length of the ship. Whereas if you go to an ocean like the North Sea, where the average wavelength tends to be shorter, then obviously if, let's say, the wavelength is one ship's length and the sea is still quite violent, say 40 foot, 50 foot high swells, well then, at that point, the bow of the ship's going to be in the trough of the wave, and the tail of the stern of the ship's going to be at the crest of the wave, and it's going to be burying its nose into the base, and then when it goes up, it's going to be doing this and this and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, quite a lot more pitch, even if the actual wave height is the same, the amplitude of the wave. And that is one of the major problems you face with the North Sea, because it's that increased pitch which will send aircraft scurrying over the side, because just angles and gravity, and that's how things work. And you see this when you look at video of stuff of ships going around in that period, and you have to be very careful when you're talking about this kind of stuff not to get confused or deceived, as some people are, by the wave caps, because it's very easy to look at the wave caps, which is the little peaks and troughs that you see all over the place, usually driven by the local wind conditions as opposed to currents and the larger wind conditions. And it's very easy to say, oh yeah, well, those little wave caps, maybe they're 2, 3, 4 foot high waves, and they're very close together, so 10, 15, 20 feet apart, which would effectively, for a ship the size of an aircraft carrier, be a flat, calm sea. But when you're looking at film footage or even photos, you have to look for where are the bigger swells, because those little caps will sit on the much larger waves that are actually rolling through the sea. And a good example of this is if you have a look at, and I believe it's online in several places, if you have a look at the film footage taken by Prince Eugen at the Battle of Denmark Strait and thereabouts, you'll see lots of tiny little wave caps with little white crests on them. But if you look closer, you'll actually see that sort of where the actual big troughs and big crests of the actual sea state is. You usually only, I think last time I looked at it, you only see maybe 2 or 3 troughs across the entire field of view, and that is because they're big waves, very substantial in terms of wavelength. They're the things that will make your ship bounce and hurl itself across the landscape, not these tiny little caps. And it's the same thing, if you look at the footage of British carriers in the North Sea when they're pitching up and down, you'll see all the little wave caps and wave crests. The caps are probably only 3 or 4 foot high, and they're spaced out at maybe 30-foot intervals. But the ship's doing this because the larger underlying waves are much, much more substantial. So, yeah, sorry, that's just a bit of oceanic wave stuff to talk about. Dale Harper says, how would USS Ranger have fared if it was rushed into the Pacific and used in combat? Badly, very badly. It had all the lack of damage resilience that Wasp had, and it didn't even have the good grace to have the speed or even technically the air capacity. So it wouldn't have been able to evade. It would have slowed down whichever group it was assigned to, and if it did get hit, it would stand a very good chance of just going up in flames like Wasp actually did. Now granted, obviously Wasp was hit by some heavyweight submarine torpedoes, but it wouldn't have taken an aerial torpedo or a 500-pounder or Japanese 550-pounder would have done pretty much the same thing. So I mean, it's possible that if Ranger was rushed in there, if it could have hung back. So you've got things like during the Guadalcanal campaign, in one of the carrier battles, Enterprise gets bombed repeatedly, but they miss Saratoga almost entirely. Not because they physically miss it in terms of dropping bombs near it and not hitting it, but because they don't realise it's there. And in the other battle, it's the other way around. Saratoga gets attacked and Enterprise gets missed for the majority of the period. So it's possible that Ranger could have lucked out, participated in a battle that it's delayed the occurrence of by being slow, and then the Japanese pilots just don't see it. But I really, really would not want to be betting on its survival for any considerable period of time. I mean, you look at the battering that Enterprise took and Saratoga took and Yorktown before its demise, that's not punishment that Ranger would have ever stood up for. Levin August, if the Japanese used Swordfish instead of Zeros and the Cape, would their planes have fared better? No. If you replace the Swordfish is many things, but replacing Zeros with Swordfish is a recipe for disaster. You now have no fighter escort. I mean, as I say, the Swordfish can do many things. Being a aircraft carrier fighter, it is definitely not. If you replace just the Kates, well, it depends if you take all the other capabilities of the Swordfish with it. If you replace the Kates with Swordfish of the period, so you give the Japanese a night attack option, then yeah, they'd fare better. The American ships, especially in the sort of 42-43 period of the war, don't really have much capability to deal with a nighttime air assault, and even later on, when radar guidance will help you deal with that, there's still a visual element that's missing from it all. So if the crew and capability translates across, then sure. But if you're going to use Swordfish instead of the Kate in daylight actions, well, maybe Pearl Harbor might go a little bit better, because the Swordfish is so hilariously slow. It gives the Japanese, while they're relatively unopposed, a lot more opportunity to line up and take aim at specific targets. But once you get into an arena where you're being opposed by radar-guided VT-fused AAA shells, the Swordfish is going to be just as much of a target practice as anything else that you could put up there. Initial driver, KMS Scharnhorst versus USS Alaska. That's something I've answered in a number of dry docks before. It basically comes down to who scores the first hit. And obviously Alaska has late war US Navy radar and fire control systems, which does give it something of an unfair advantage, because of course Scharnhorst is sunk mid-war, so therefore its systems are not going to be as advanced. If you were to take Scharnhorst, a theoretical Scharnhorst that survives into 1945 with the latest and greatest German radar and fire control capability, that puts it on, I wouldn't necessarily say an even keel, but a lot closer to even in terms of fire control with Alaska. The thing is, Scharnhorst is considerably better protected than Alaska, but Alaska's guns hit a lot harder. So my rough rule of thumb would indicate that they're probably about as dangerous to each other as the other is to the first one, at which point, who hits which ship first and scores them a telling blow. Whoever disrupts either a good chunk of the opponent's main armament, speed, or fire control systems is probably the one who's going to win. Alaska's got much less protection, so if Scharnhorst hits it first, there's a much greater chance of damage being done. Conversely, for all of Scharnhorst's greater protection, Alaska's guns are far more powerful. So yeah, it's a coin toss, assuming the time periods are the same. Of course, if you take late 43 Scharnhorst against late 45 Alaska, then of course Alaska has a bunch of additional advantages. JC asks, why do armoured ships, specifically World War I and II battleships, have porthole windows? Don't they compromise the armour? They would if they were on the armour, but the armour on the sides of ships does not cover, especially by World War II, the entire length of the ship. So where you see portholes, that's where the armour isn't. And where you don't see them, usually that's where the armour is. So they don't put the two simultaneous. Although it does give you a good idea of trying to work out which parts of the ship are protected and which parts aren't. So when you're looking at photos, obviously when you're looking in the distance and you're firing naval guns at 10, 12, 15, 20, 25,000 yard range, whether or not there are portholes in a specific part of the ship doesn't really matter, because you probably only see just a silhouette. But if you look at some of the, say, the County class ships and other ships that were refitted extensively with additional armour, you will see in some places where there are portholes that appear to have been plated up. So that's where there were portholes where it wasn't an armoured section of the ship, but somebody has gone in and after the fact installed armour plate, and obviously those portholes have then been blanked off. Michael Brian, or O'Brien, sorry, also asks, had the US Navy known of and believed the capabilities of the Type 93 torpedoes from the beginning of World War II, how could that have affected various battles? It probably would have affected a lot of the early war stuff quite significantly, because if they'd absolutely believed the true figures about how far a Type 93 torpedo could reach, then they almost certainly would have turned around and said, hang on a minute, this isn't going to work. We need to either engage Japanese ships at a range such that the torpedoes have no chance of reaching us, i.e. very long range gunnery duels in the 25,000 yard region, or we need to charge down through that extended range as fast as humanly possible and put a big emphasis on evasive action and to get into our own torpedo range. And that might be another option that they take, or they might advocate for a mixture of both, depending on exactly which of what the situation is. But yeah, the stuff that you see at Tassafaronga, where they sit ostensibly, although not in actuality, outside of their own torpedo range and assume that the Japanese can't reach them, that almost certainly wouldn't happen. You'd hope, at least. Knight 6831, do you find the metal scavenging of Prince of Wales repulse... Oh. Where the heck? There's a huge jump there. Right, so Knight 6831, do you find the metal scavenging of Prince of Wales, Repulse, Electra, Encounter, and Exodus disgusting and an absolute disgrace as I do? Yes, and they're graves, what other politics might be associated with them? They are graves of people who died, and, broadly speaking, most cultures these days don't agree with digging up the recently dead, or just ploughing them over for whatever reason. So, even if you're part of a country or political movement or whatever that for whatever reason doesn't particularly respect the nations that those ships served, or the notion of war graves or whatever, fundamentally it comes down to, these are graves. Would you like somebody digging up your grandmother or grandfather for profit after looting their bodies? Probably not. So don't do it yourself. Everything else, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to any other argumentation, can effectively go take a hike, because that's basic humanity at that point. And let's face it, there's more than enough other scrap steel in the world. Amnuk, is there a dry dock in Europe that can take Yamato? Yeah, there's a few. In World War II, the Saint-Nazaire dry dock, the one that Campbelltown blew up to prevent Tirpitz getting in there, is probably the single biggest candidate, because the French did build that thing very large. The thing is with Yamato, it's not actually... It displaces a lot, but it's not actually that long. When you look at sort of Yamato alongside Iowa, I think actually Iowa is a fraction longer. Yamato is a lot fatter, effectively. It has a lot more beam, and that's where all the extra displacement comes from, in broad terms. Frank Sposato, how do you feel about any of the Japanese Navy ships getting scrapped by merchants? Do you see those as any different than the Allied ships that happened to? I'm assuming that's related to this question about the war graves. I think it would depend on what ships you're talking about. So if it's a Japanese Navy ship like, say, Mutsu, which explodes in harbour and sinks, and then presents a navigation hazard to people, well, the Japanese are the ones who decide to get rid of that because it's taking up valuable space in a harbour. So at that point, it's kind of, well, it's their ship. they have good reason to do so, and presumably because it's their ship and it's their sailors, they will take whatever culturally appropriate measures there are to respect the dead and possibly recover the bodies. If it comes to just ships generically out at sea that have been scrapped and salvaged by merchants, again, it would come down to me for why are they doing it and who's given them permission. If they've just gone out and said, okay, this is a bunch of scrap metal, we're going to have it out of hand, then see my previous comments about the looting of Repulse and Prince of Wales's wrecks. Regardless of exactly who these people fought for, everyone's equal in death. It doesn't change the fact they serve the Japanese Navy, doesn't change that. But again, I say, if the Japanese authorities, who are the ones who should have the final say over Japanese Navy wrecks, have said, yes, you may go and salvage it with whatever appropriate conditions and ceremonies are relevant, well, that's their decision at that point, as opposed to what's happening with some of the Allied wrecks, which is very definitely illegal and without permission. Talkie Walkie Meat Pete. How much would it cost to build a replica battleship today? Which would you build, and could we crowdfund it? How much would it cost? Depends on the battleship. I mean, if you want to build a replica Yamato, it's going to cost an absolute fortune. If you want to build, I don't know, a replica Majestic or a replica Warrior, it's still going to cost a lot of money, but probably considerably less. And also, to what standard are you building the replica? Are you building it in terms of a visual appearance only? I.e., you could build it out of modern materials, and the armour plate, whether it be on turrets or on the belt, etc., is effective, just maybe like a hollow fiberglass representation, or in which case it would be cheaper, or are you actually going to manufacture 12-inch armour plate to install, in which case it's going to be correspondingly more expensive. And the same thing with the guns. It's like, are the guns going to be hollow replicas that look the part but could never fire, or are you actually going to remanufacture a fully working piece of naval artillery? That's going to significantly affect the cost, and in some places the legality of the whole thing. In terms of which would you build, well, what are my favourite battleships? One of those. Could you crowdfund it? I don't even want to. I mean, even for something quote unquote minor like a Warrior or one of the small Ironclads, I don't even want to think about the money involved. It's still going to be like high six-figure minimum for, like, maybe if you did one of the 2,000-3,000 ton Ironclad ships and decided to do basically a modern ship, a modern materials vessel that just visually looked the part but was otherwise a modern materials replica. Even that's going to be high six figures, I would imagine, and anything more complex or larger than that is going to be much larger. So I don't think I'm going to be crowdfunding that kind of thing anytime soon. Chazek asks, Stargate Prometheus versus an Omega from Babylon 5. I'm going to go with the Omega class. At least Prometheus as it's presented in the initial SG-1 episodes, when it's basically a mostly Earth-built ship with some scavenged alien tech, because at that point, it's not got shields, or it's got some very minimal shields. It's armed with a few railguns and missiles. An Omega, which is much larger and has a bunch of energy weapons and starfighters and such, is going to be a far, far superior combatant. Towards the end of its life, when it's got a little bit more in the way of sort of Asgard shielding and more advanced energy weaponry and such, then things might change a bit. Depends on exactly how you quantify those kinds of things. So yes, it's a sliding scale at that point. Neolites asks, what was Nelson doing during the sinking of the Bismarck? Nelson was actually off the west coast of Africa at the time. She was actually trying to make her way north to engage, but everyone figured out, distance and time and her speed were not in favour of her actually getting anywhere close. Initial Driver asks, what were the main differences between the Japanese Army and Japanese Navy Imperial Japanese Army Navy and Imperial Japanese Navy in terms of capabilities and mission? So yeah, the Japanese Army did in fact have their own navy. They even had a few small aircraft carriers, but the majority of ships operated by the Imperial Japanese Army were concerned, somewhat unsurprisingly, with troop transport, amphibious assaults and landings, and the support thereof, whether in terms of small air groups or ferrying aircraft to forward airfields. So the Japanese Army's navy was far more capable in terms of conducting an amphibious assault, but basically, apart from maybe a few anti-submarine aircraft, had effectively nothing that could actually stand up to a serious surface fleet in terms of an actual, full-on engagement, whereas the Japanese Navy could go toe-to-toe with lots of different people's warships, but if you took what was strictly just the Japanese Navy on its own, was pretty hopeless if it came to actually invading anywhere. Sad Wings Raging says, this is for Mrs. Drack. Thank you very much. Mrs. Drack, you've had a donation made for your work on the screen. She says, yay. Jean-Carlos Mijos asks, have you considered doing a special on the Shetland bus service or Leif Andreas Larsen, known as Shetland's Larsen? The Shetland bus service is on my list of things to do, but it's a very long list, put it that way. So, yeah, we will eventually get round to it, but at the moment, I would say I have something of I wouldn't say not a surplus, but a very gratifying number of people who want to speak to me, or agree to speak to me and give expert interviews and help with research and stuff, because they're specialists in their field, and interviews with actual veterans while we've still got them. So I mean, the list was years long anyway, so it is on the list. Where exactly on that list it is now, I really couldn't tell you. Right, where are we? Emperor Dave asks, was Trafalgar the battle that important? Even if the British lose decisively, Napoleon's army has left the Channel and there are more fleets. I get that the campaign matters, but does the battle? Yes, in a number of ways. Partly just because the battle results in the loss to the Franco-Spanish forces of a lot of some of their, for lack of a better term, front rank capital ships. So it significantly alters the balance of power even more than it already was in favour of the British in terms of ships of the line. It also establishes an ascendancy of the British fleets, because up until this point, within certain respects, the Franco-Spanish forces have been willing to meet the British on the field of battle, if you like, at various points. But after Trafalgar, it becomes progressively harder and harder to persuade Franco-Spanish forces to put to sea in any significant numbers. They still do sally out with large squadrons and such, but that is pretty much the tipping point of, we're not even going to bother trying to engage 25 plus strong British battle line anymore. Now, granted, obviously there is Admiral Calder's fleet, which caused Villeneuve to divert into Cadiz in the first place, which could stand into the to try and block the Franco-Spanish advance up the channel. But it is as much a matter of morale as anything else. If the Battle of Trafalgar is fought and lost, that's going to have a huge morale impact on the Royal Navy, and a considerable morale boost to the Franco-Spanish forces. If you effectively eliminate that element of the Royal Navy ship of the line force, then other Franco-Spanish ships of the line can be brought in to form an overwhelming numbers type of scenario. And then potentially, yes, the Napoleon has decided he's going to go after Russia instead. Turns out that was a mistake. But armies can be countermarched if the situation presents itself. Maybe not in 1805, but the thing about this kind of scenario is that at least in World War I and World War II, if something goes dramatically wrong on the scale of how Trafalgar could have gone, bearing in mind Trafalgar, as you said, is only a portion of both sides' strength, then you can rush other portions of your fleet in by high-speed steaming to try and patch the holes if you have a significant vulnerability. Whereas in the Age of Sail, just getting orders out to the ships that you need to then spend months coming back to try and make up the vulnerability, it means that there is the window of opportunity for the other side to exploit is significantly longer. Baron Thomas says, I see the blockade runner Dash Corellian Corvette behind you. Do you apply your naval knowledge to Star Wars as well? Yeah, sometimes. I am a big fan of Star Wars for the most part, so hence the Corvette. So, Star Wars, Battlefleet, Gothic, Star Trek, Babylon 5, as you probably guessed, etc., etc. Vice Admiral Nelson, I know you'd like to see a German Navy ship named after Captain Langsdorff. In your view, would Captain Luckner of the SMS Seeadler be a suitable candidate as well? Yeah, might as well. He's got no sort of major black mark against him. Conducted himself honourably in the course of conflict. Yeah, he was on the opposite side, but someone's got to be. So yeah, of the various captains that the German Navy could choose to name their ships after, Luckner is as good a candidate. Well, not as good a candidate. He's a better candidate than most. I say honourable sea service, fairly good story behind him, pretty good adventure. So, pretty nice. Pretty good choice. Knight 6831, why were the Japanese so incapable of stopping the Royal Navy's air attacks on the Japanese-held oil refineries in Sumatra? And did the loss of Prince of Wales and Repulse factor into how successful the air attacks presumably were? The Royal Navy air attacks on the Sumatran oil refineries in 1944 obviously somewhat apart from the loss of Prince of Wales and Repulse. This is kind of when Saratoga joins up with the Eastern Fleet, which would later become the British Pacific Fleet, as part of their roll-up through that element of the Pacific. In terms of why they weren't capable of stopping the Royal Navy's air attacks, well, one, they have a very big US Navy-shaped problem coming the other way, and two, for whatever else you might say about the Fleet Air Arms aircraft, they are still pretty capable by this point. Okay, the Seafire does have a habit of breaking itself sort of in every one out of every two landings, and the Firefly is still a two-seater fighter, but the Firefly turns out to make a half-decent fighter bomber. The Barracuda's not awful, and the Seafire, as long as it's got the legs to actually be around, is pretty decent. And of course they've got Avengers and Corsairs as well, so the Fleet Air Arm does have a fair punch to it by the time of the Sumatran air raids. And between the rather large Essex swarm distraction and the fact that for the Japanese they really are a bit on their last legs militarily at this point, they're not that able to meaningfully oppose the British attacks. I mean, they still do. The Royal Navy still loses aircraft, but there's a difference between we made an effort and we actually accomplished tremendously much in terms of opposition. Animal16365 asks, in your first video this past Wednesday on ironclads, did the wooden ships that were converted suffer increased transverse or longitudinal stress in the hull or framing inside the hull? Yes. This was a major concern going into it, and as I mentioned, once the lessons of the first generation of wooden conversions came out, one of the things the Royal Navy realised was you can't lengthen the ship's hulls that much. They tried initially to fit steam power and to give them more guns down the broadside because, you're lessening the number of guns because you're lessening the number of gun decks. But they very quickly realised that the amount of stress that all this extra weight put on the ship's sides was too much. It caused a lot of hogging, a lot of sagging, and wood is flexible in and of itself, but you've got to remember these ships were designed to support, okay, fair enough, the weight of lots of guns, but the guns themselves were usually 32-pounders, maybe a few 68-pounders, not all 68s or even 7-8-inch muzzle-loading rifles. And even if you took all of the guns that, say, a 131 gunner or a 98 gunner was supposed to be using, melted them down and spread them out as armour, that still wouldn't come even close to the amount of armour in terms of thickness and surface area that they were putting onto these ships. So yeah, there was a lot of additional stress, and it's the reason why, one of the many reasons why wooden-hulled ironclads didn't last all that long. They did in some ships try to stiffen them by introducing iron cross bracing to give them a bit more stiffness and help cope with the stress, but that's really a patch on a much larger problem, which is fundamentally, if you're going to build an armoured vessel, you really need it to have an iron hull at minimum. Anton Alert asks, if a ship is forced to flood magazines and survives, what happens to the ammunition when the compartment is dried out? Is it a total loss? Usually yes, although it depends on what the ammunition is. The charges, whether that be cordite or powder or whatever, if those magazines are flooded, then yeah, as anyone who's ever operated any kind of firearm will tell you, the absolute last thing you will ever want to do is get your propellant soaking wet, especially with contaminated water like seawater, then dry it out and set it off and hope for the best. Because at that point, the best that you can hope for is, a partial burn with basically a damp squib of firing. At worst, the whole thing just goes off like a bomb, which is, not useful. The shells, on the other hand, depending on the type of shell, what they're, how they're packed, and so on and so forth, those might be salvageable because they're designed to be a lot more resistant to things. So, some of the shells might be able to be reused, but yes, it depends on what's happened, how long have they been underwater, what kind of shells are they, what condition were they in at the time, because again, some shells were just stored on racks, some shells were stored in boxes, so if they're stored in boxes they might have been preserved better than shells that were just out in the open, and so on and so forth. There we go. Thomas Hobarth, what is the best and worst modern battleship after 1920 and Dreadnought before 1920 ever built, in your opinion? Before 1920, I mean, it's hard to beat the Queen Elizabeth. They are the fastest Dreadnought battleships, not counting the battle cruisers, and obviously they go on to have quite a long and developed lifespan. Worst Dreadnought before 1920 sadly has to go to the Espana class because they are just bad, but that's because of their size more than anything else. Best and worst modern battleship, after 1920. Well, this is where you're going to get the eternal argument between Iowa and Yamato in terms of best or worst battleship ever built, because at that point, as I've said before, that's more down to systems rather than the guns and armour of the individual ships. The fire control is far more important if you're talking an Iowa Yamato fight. In terms of worst post-1920 battleship, well, at that point, you're basically talking about the Treaty-era battleships and technically the Washington Treaty ships. So for the British, that's King George V of Vanguard and Nelson. For the Japanese, that's Nagato and Yamato. For the Americans, that's the Colorados, North Carolinas, South Dakotas, and Iowas. Italians, it's the Littorios. The French, it's the Richelieu, because, well, technically the Dunkirks, although I tend to count them as battle cruisers. The Russians don't complete anything. Scharnhorst and Bismarck for the Germans. That's pretty much it at that point in terms of completed battleships. That's a more difficult one, I would say. Most of those ships have strengths and weaknesses that you can argue play off of each other. I mean, in terms of weakest armament, the Scharnhorsts, obviously, but, you know, other than that, the Scharnhorsts are pretty quick and reasonably well protected for their size. Then you've got Nagato, which, you know, for a 16-inch battleship really has some fairly pathetic armour, but is, for its time, relatively swift and relatively well armed. And then you've got North Carolina and the fact that, well, it's not armoured against its own guns because they switched up to 16-inch and has this horrific vibration issue, but at the same time you've got, you know, Washington showed her guns can still do a hilarious amount of damage when turned on Hiroshima. So I would say, yeah, if you're just looking at the Washington Treaty and thereafter battleships, it's if you're looking at the actual battleships themselves in terms of speed, protection, and firepower, it's much more difficult to make a call as to worst. To get into that kind of thing, you have to start looking into, again, systems and crews and other factors. Mostly, to be honest, fire control systems. But then again, that depends on how well the country did with radar, which, in a lot of cases, which doesn't necessarily reflect much about the capabilities of the ships themselves. Initial driver says, by the way, the backlight is causing the image not to show. I don't think there's a backlight on there. Let's have a look at the settings. Ah, there is a brightness there. What happens if I turn the brightness right down? Okay, just turn the brightness down to 0. Wrong playlist. Let's see if that has any effect. Now I'm watching the slight delay. That does actually seem to have worked somewhat. I think there still is some glare coming from somewhere. I don't know where, but, well. We shall have to see. Jacob Moss says, as I remember, Drac, you are somewhat familiar with the steampunk world Leviathans Conquer the Skies. Yes, I am. With aerial destroyers, cruisers, and battleships running around in this world, do surface naval vessels have a future? Potentially, yes, because any kind of technology that allows you to fly around with something the size of a battleship also allows you to make a surface ship considerably lighter, but at the end of the day, whatever this technology you're using has to support the entire weight of an airborne vessel, whereas in the sea does a fairly good job of supporting a lot of the weight, i.e. the displacement, of a conventional naval vessel. So if you can come up with, using the same technology just to lighten your surface vessel, you can increase its density quite significantly in terms of either armor, more guns, or both. Now, you probably won't be able to match the speed of an aerial battleship, but you, for the same money, would be able to make a surface naval vessel either far larger or far more heavily armed or far more heavily armoured, or possibly a combination of all three, than you could ever do with an aerial vessel, which is going to give you a significant amount of advantage in a fight between the two. Obviously, the aerial ship is going to have the mobility advantage and the speed advantage, but the surface vessel would be very difficult to kill. Which, for things like troop movements and such, or large cargoes, etc., they would definitely still have their niche, or at least the big ones would. I think smaller ships like destroyers and cruisers are probably put out of business by having flying versions running around, but battleships perhaps less so. Megascro asks, have there been trials or designs for unusual turrets, such as a quad but in 2x2 format instead of 4x1, or a 4.5-inch AA turret on top of a main battery turret? Well, the French ironclads... that's not French ironclads, what am I talking about? The French battleships, Richelieu and Dunkirk, their turrets technically are two twin turrets that happen to share a common turntable in a number of ways. If you mean instead 2x2 as in 2 guns on the bottom, 2 guns on the top, all as one gun house, there were a few design concepts for that kind of thing put together, sort of stacked guns within a same gun house, although obviously didn't really come into play in World War I or World War II. In terms of mounting an anti-aircraft turret on top of a main battery turret, not in terms of something like a 4.5-inch or a 5-inch. It's just, one, they're a bit too big and heavy, and two, when you're talking about something that size, i.e. a heavy anti-aircraft gun turret, you need to take into account you've got to feed the ammunition from somewhere. So it's okay to put 20 mils, 40 mils on top of a main battery turret, because you can stack a ton of ammunition in there, in the cupola or whatever, to keep firing away with. But when you're talking about something that 120 plus millimeter guns, you really don't want to have two separate systems of ammunition and hoisting going up through the main battery turret, especially considering obviously that's a weakness. If the smaller turret on top gets hit and its ammunition catches fire, then you've now got a weakness in the top of your turret that could carry that ammunition fire down into your main turret, which, well, let's just say that main battery turret fires don't tend to end well. Quinn the Q asks, who had the first navy, not an army with boats, but actually declaring a navy as a new and distinct branch of a nation-state's military? Off the top of my head, I genuinely don't know, because we don't know as much as we'd like to about the properly ancient navies. Now, of course, there's also stuff like China, Korea, possibly Japan, etc., etc. These other nations whose naval histories I don't know, especially in the distant past, don't know as much about. But if we look just at kind of the Western Hemisphere, the Mediterranean, etc., world powers as far back as ancient Egypt and ancient Assyria are known from artwork reliefs to have had warships, but whether those ships counted as just generically part of the country's armed forces, whether they were counted as basically just transports for the navy, or whether they counted as their own separate naval services, I don't think we can at this point say for certain, because we just don't have enough information about them. So it could be one of those, or it could be some later navy that we actually know about in sort of the Phoenician, Greek, Roman period. Initial driver, were the Fuso class battleships actually modern and respected, or were they looked at as a rather lackluster compared to other classes at the time? At the time that they were built, they were relatively competitive with everybody else's. So at the time the Fusos and Iseis are being built, you're looking at, the standard 12, 14-inch guns. The Fusos also have 12, 14-inch guns. It's just they use 6 twins instead of 4 triples because of different ideas about how many targets they're going to be engaging. And the British are using the 8, 15-inch format of the QEs and Rs. So, yeah, they're pretty competitive on the world stage at the time that they're launched. Baron Thomas, are you a fan of Patrick O'Brien or Hornblower? Yes to both. Michael O'Brien, Battle of Sumatra, all of Taffy 3 versus the 2nd Pacific Squadron, Kamchatka having left the 2nd Pacific Squadron in search of Japanese torpedo boats the previous day. That's going to be the Taffys to win, because unlike the historical engagements, they even Taffy 3's slowest ships, the escort carriers and destroyer escorts, can outrun the 2nd Pacific Squadron. So, if it wants to, between radar, fire control, what for the time are what for sort of the 2nd Pacific Squadron will be stupidly long-range torpedoes, etc. Johnston and company can probably just go in, hit at ranges beyond which 2nd Pacific Squadron can reply from, and probably also launch torpedoes from a range beyond really effective reply range of the 2nd Pacific Squadron, and everyone else can just stay ahead of them until they have reconfigured their air groups with the appropriate munitions, and then go up against a group of targets that have basically no torpedo defense and no anti-aircraft defense either. So I think that's pretty one-sided for the Taffys. Smiling Nid asks, do you think making writers play war games like Star Wars Armada and General Quarters would make naval and space battles look better? It might make naval battles look a little bit better. Part of the problem with putting naval battles on screen is that outside of a very, very few, when you're involving multiple ships, they tend to be quite spaced out, especially World War II, which doesn't look as good on camera, and they artificially bunch everything up, which, is just the start of things. So playing something like General Quarters might make the naval stuff work better, but also, just doing naval films of periods where you can legitimately bunch everything up a bit closer to each other. That might also help. I mean, to be honest, basically don't do World War II. Unless you're going to do something like the Battle of Narvik, where everyone's crammed into a fjord. Then go for something like World War I. I mean, Jutland, for all its size and scale, the ships in the individual columns, etc., are actually bunched pretty close together. So the only thing you might, and possibly you don't even have to shorten, is the overall range of the battle. But the formations of ships being up close together, that would actually be relatively realistic. And then once you get much before that, so 2nd Pacific Squadron, Battle of Tsushima, and then back into the age of the Ironclad and the age of sail, everyone's bunched close up together. You could do, the Battle of Trafalgar, you have 50 plus ships fighting it out in an area which in a World War II sort of aircraft carrier battle, you might find 2 ships from one side in. So something like that, you just get a bit of a better feel for tactics and you're golden. In terms of space naval battles, well, it's a 3D environment. I don't think making them play war games which are, to a greater or lesser extent, 2-dimensional is going to help them all that much with that. Maybe getting them to play something like Homeworld might help, though. Colin Cameron, thanks for the reading suggestions. I've started reading the Ark Royal series, 2 books in so far, and enjoying it. Excellent. Tyler Adams, was there anything 2nd Pacific Squadron could have done to win the Battle of Tsushima? They had so many limitations. I mean, as I said before, their gunnery wasn't too bad, believe it or not. By the time they actually got there, Rozhesvensky had done a pretty good job of turning their gunnery performance around, but their shells were subpar in terms of destructive power compared to the Japanese. Their ships were, ragged, slow, covered in lots of burnable materials, coal dust if nothing else, and a lot of paint. So, I mean, if they'd found somewhere to stop a few days sail away from where they would end up fighting, and they stripped the ships down, like taken out all the burnables, stripped down the paint, washed off the coal dust, I mean, they wouldn't have caught fire quite as badly, but they really, in order for them to win, they effectively would need to have Japanese shells, because they did score a number of fairly important hits early on. It's just the shells didn't really exploit them that much. And Togo's fleet did do this kind of turn around a point where they could have been completely punished. So a little bit extra luck or a little bit more training with gunnery and getting their hands on somewhat more destructive shells, and they probably could have forced at least a draw. But it's a lot to ask, and it's not something that really they could have plausibly done at that point. Thomas Hobarth asks, if the German Navy was somehow been allowed to keep SMS Baden as their flagship, how would this have influenced the construction of Scharnhorst and Gneisenau? Not that much, to be honest. For one thing, the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau borrowed more from German battlecruiser concepts from the First World War than they did from the battleship concepts. And secondly, there were a lot more designs beyond Baden that the Imperial Germany drew up, which, if they're going to draw on anything, it's going to have been from those designs rather than a ship that, to be honest, its design predates the First World War. Whereas even as late as 1918, the Imperial German Naval Staff is drawing up more advanced designs, Große Kreuzer and battleships. So the L-20E Alpha is one of the battleship versions thereof, but there's plenty of different battlecruiser designs as well. So having Baden as the flagship, it would have been nice, but there would have been plenty of design work on the table out there that's 3, 4, 5 years more advanced than that of Baden for them to draw on. Alexander Shugaev asks, if the Nelson class only, quote unquote, had 5 6-inch turrets, i.e. 4 super firing on both sides and a singular one on the stern, would it compromise its firepower too much? And what could be done with the free deck space, with the free mass and deck space? It probably wouldn't have compromised it too much, to be honest. I mean, it's their dedicated anti-surface secondary batteries. Especially in hindsight, we know they weren't of any particularly great use. So having the free mass and deck space, if they'd gone with it originally in the 1920s, you probably would have seen them try to squeeze a bit more weight into either protection or beefing up the structure of the main battery to try and obviate some of the issues that eventually would crop up with the 16-inch guns. If they just otherwise go with, well, we're just going to be coming a little bit underweight, then obviously that gives a lot more flexibility going forwards to mount anti-aircraft weaponry and so forth. I mean, obviously the Nelson class didn't go in for modernization, but I strongly suspect that if they had done, they probably would have had the secondary batteries removed and replaced with twin 4.5s in the same locations, and then more 4.5s in other places because of the saved weight. Knight 6831 asks, if HMS Ark Royal didn't get sunk, when would she have been decommissioned? Depends on how much she gets worn out in the rest of the wartime period, because her hangar height and her size and her deck space would actually make her, on paper, a candidate to stick around a lot longer than the Illustriouses and Implacables. In fact, actually, she would have been a much better candidate for a refit in the 50s and 60s than Victorious was. But you have to caveat that with the fact, she's going to have seen out the entire war. So if she's got damaged or just worn out during the conflict, she may well have been decommissioned in the early 50s, maybe act as a training carrier for a bit, and then been decommissioned just on the grounds that she's worn out. Whereas, if for whatever reason somehow she isn't worn out, maybe she has a big modernization booked in towards the end of the war, or something like that, then she might have actually stuck it out for a surprisingly long time. She might have ended up being kind of an ancillary to the Audacious class, at which point you probably would have got HMS Audacious. Excuse me. Initial Driver asks, I recently started looking at the Indian Ocean campaigns of the mid-1500s, specifically the sieges of Dieu. What do you think could have been done differently to win both battles by either side? Unfortunately, I can't give you an answer right now because that's not enough. It's not a period that I have studied in any particular depth. I certainly can look into it. Drop me an email or a Discord message if you'd like me to look into it in a bit more detail and come back to you with an answer separately from the live stream. And I'll do some research and see what I can find out. But as I say, unfortunately, mid-1500s Indian Ocean conflicts, not something I've studied in any great detail at this point in time. Nagato class asks, how easy is modifying a carrier to have larger elevators or hangars? Mainly thinking of the Shikakus and late war aircraft, but the US and UK as well. Extremely difficult, because the hangars, the elevators are cut, especially if we're talking about World War II, usually cut into the hull on the centre line. So you're talking about some fairly major structural alterations there, and especially for the British, where you've got an armoured flight deck, cutting through that is going to be an absolute pain. You could go for installing side hangars instead in a refit. So keep the smaller centerline hangar and put a side hangar on. That's a bit easier to pull off, albeit expensive. But yeah, not really. Upgrading the centerline lifts is going to be quite difficult, if not impossible, in terms of reasonable budget. And the hangar height, that's basically no, because the only way you're going to substantially increase the hangar height on a carrier is by effectively peeling off the flight deck, adding an extension to the hangar deck, and then reinstalling in the entire flight deck, which is just such a huge operation. You might as well probably build a new ship, because it's not going to be just that. It's going to be the fact by doing that you have completely changed the ship's stability. So unless you say took a British armoured flight deck carrier, removed the armoured flight deck, let's say, racked up the hangar height, and then put in an unarmoured flight deck, you might get away with that. I would have to run the stability calculations, but you might just about manage to get away with that. But yeah, I wouldn't be too confident about the stability there, and also at that point then you have basically no protection against bombs. So Yeah. Um. X Crossbow asks if USS Kentucky is finished in mid 46 and is a 5th hour class now in service. How does this change how these now 5 battleships are serviced post World War II? Does this change how many hours survive today? Maybe. Maybe not. Initially, it's probably not going to change all that much. The South Dakotas are kept in mothballs for quite a long time, so maybe the North Carolinas and South Dakotas will get disposed of a little bit faster. But the Iowas, whether they're 4 or 5, are going to stay around for quite a long period of time. Where it might have a difference is when you get the turret explosion in Iowa. If you've got 5, the Navy might think about just getting rid of Iowa at that point and Kentucky taking its place. So you've still got 4 battleships. That's probably really the only change, other than, for reactivations. If you've got 5, they may only choose to reactivate a lesser number rather and leave one in almost in mint condition. Thank you, Moritz Tabor. Flying Dutchman asks, why did HMS Barham and HMS Malaya not receive the same upgrades the other Queen Elizabeths got in the 1930s? Ironically enough, because they were the last to receive the first stage of modernization refits that the Queen Elizabeths got. So if you look at the profiles of the Queen Elizabeth class through the years, broadly speaking, you can divide it up into 3 periods. You've got how they looked when they were initially built. You've then got their 1920s appearance, and then for Warspite, Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, you've got the modernizations in the 30s. And because Barham and Malaya had been the last of the ones to receive the first set of refits and modernizations, it meant that whilst they were theoretically on the list to be modernized if war hadn't broken out, they were held to be sort of Queen Elizabeth, Warspite, and Valiant needed the work sooner. And so they went in first, and then thereafter, Malaya and Barham, Repulse, Hood, etc. would have gone in for modernizations, but of course war stopped that, so they were left in their sort of prior forms. Prince of Tonga pointing out, if Ark Royal had survived the war, it probably gets decommissioned in 45, being almost completely worn out. Yeah, they might keep it around for a little bit as a training carrier until it completely breaks down. But yeah, it's the wearing out that, if anything else, that's really going to mess it around. Okay, Fushi Smith says USS Zumwalt with a giant meatball logo on the flag gets teleported to 1944, 1,000 yards off the port bow of USS Missouri. Time for them to fight. Missouri wins because... at 1,000 yards, Missouri can start laying into it with basically point-blank fire from its 5-inch guns, and to be honest, at 1,000 yards, even from the 40 mils, practically immediately. Zumwalt, maybe maybe some phalanxes. That's probably about it in terms of that immediate rapid response. In theory, you could probably jury-rig some kind of short-range missile to start firing off, but not as fast as the 5-inch and 40 mils are going to lay into you. And then, maybe you can start launching SM2s or SM6s in this kind of semi-surface attack mode. But one, that's going to take longer than it's going to take Missouri secondaries to open up on you, so you may not be able to do that anyway because you're going to be taking hits. And with the best will in the world, using some surface-to-air missiles in a bit of a jury-rigged attack role, you might smash up the top works of Missouri well enough, but you're not going to do it fast enough to stop Missouri from just turning its main turrets 90 degrees and just obliterating you. You know, at longer ranges, maybe, but, you know, at 1,000 yards, that's basically point blank. I mean, it's like, it would be basically like saying, well, what if you took a guy with a pistol in his holster and put him 3 feet away from a guy armed with a knife? It's like, technically the guy with the pistol has more advanced weaponry. It's still not going to help him because of the range and the speed at which his opponent can decide to do something about it. Bobby Grobert, do you have any recommended books to read about the Royal Navy or Russian Imperial Navy history? Much love from Minnesota. So thank you. So for Royal Navy history, I mean, there's a lot of it. Depends how far back you want to go. And also, see, if you said ships, I could very easily recommend you things like, say, D.K. Brown's series, which, you know, that covers the 19th and 20th centuries. For Russian Imperial Navy history, you've got Russian and Soviet Battleships by Steve McLaughlin, which, I mean, okay, it's the battleships, it's not everything else, but if you want to know about the more general history, there's a lot of books on the Royal Navy. I think there's a fairly good one, if I can remember the title correctly. I think it's To Command the Waves. It's kind of one of those telephone book-sized ones, but that's a pretty good summation of Royal Navy history as a whole. It's either To Command the Waves or To Command the Seas. Let me have a look. No, I don't want to know about commanding weaves. That's it. I was a little bit wrong in the title. The Command of the Ocean, A Naval History of Britain 1649 to 1815 by N.A.M. Roger. That's a pretty good sort of age of sail period coverage, and then I'd recommend picking up something like T.K. Brown's books for the next part. For the Russian stuff, there's not a tremendous amount of good work on the Russian Imperial Navy in English, which is a bit of a pity. There's Russian sailing warships, or Russian warships of the Age of Sail, something like that. That's actually a very good book, I would say, because it is, again, more of a technical work on the ships themselves, but it puts them in the context of everything else the Russian Imperial Navy was doing, from Peter the Great through to the Battle of Sinop and beyond. Let me see if I can, again, find the book title there for you. There you go. Russian Warships in the Age of Sail. Design, Construction, Careers and Fates. 1696 to 1860. That is probably, at least from my perspective, the best one to cover the bulk of the history of the Russian Imperial Navy. Okay. And now everything's jumped to the point that... Okay, it won't actually let me go back any further. Wow. Okay, then. Okay, let's see. No, it legitimately is taking away my ability to answer everything. Okay. Craig Bryant, do you think boiler-operated aircraft carriers are faster or nuclear aircraft carriers are faster by speed? Nuclear-powered carriers. Because they can generate more power and they can generate it on effectively a near-permanent basis. Thomas Hobarth, why did the Japanese convert Shinano into an aircraft carrier and not rebuild the Iseis into full carriers? Because Shinano was only partially completed. Rebuilding the Iseis, you would have to tear them down and then build them back up again, and even then, compared to Shinano, they would not have offered anywhere close to the same level of functionality. Not that Shinano ended up offering all that much functionality, but you know. Denmark Raider, I don't know what's going on with Wargaming at the moment. If there's more drama going on, well, I will have to look into what all the drama is and find out why do people get involved in drama. Anyway, I'll have a look and see what's going on with the drama with Wargaming and see what's happening. Yeah, who knows. We'll have to see what's going on there. Smiling Nid asks, how is yellow turret Bismarck a question thing? Lots of people say the ship did have it. Did no one take notes? Yeah, this is one of the things, appearances of ships, even as late as World War II, get so argued about. And a lot of it is, to be honest, is down to a lot of people screaming about their personal interpretations of a bunch of scattered reports and references, because, there are references to painting the tops of certain turrets yellow during Bismarck's last voyage. But there's also references to like what external observers saw. There's some references to some of the paint coming off, and it's like, so which turrets were actually painted, how long did that paint last, what had washed off, and therefore at any given stage in the campaign or its voyage, at what point was the yellow paint applied, at what point was it lost from some turrets and not others. There probably were notes on Bismarck about, on X date, we ordered the crew to paint the such and such turrets with yellow tops. And there may even be notes that, we're going to have to at some point repaint these turrets or get some better paint because this paint has washed off, etc. There probably were records kept aboard the ship that would allow us to answer those questions, but of course those records went to the bottom with Bismarck, so who knows. Initial driver, why didn't the Royal Navy shell the French ports instead of sending ineffectual air raids to deny their usage earlier in the war when the home fleet exists? Partly because they had other things to worry about. Because you've got to remember that in the initial period when France had just fallen, the Royal Navy was having to scramble to contend with both the fact that the Marine Nationale was now out of the war, so areas that the Marine Nationale was supposed to cover now had to be covered by the Royal Navy, and almost simultaneous with that was Italy's entry into the war. So they were having to scramble to counter that threat as well as make up for the gaps left by the Marine Nationale going out of the war, which meant that they didn't really have large numbers of capital ships on hand to go and start shooting up French ports. And by the time the situation had stabilised and they could even begin to think about it, even if they wanted to, well, by that point, you would face either shelling German-occupied French ports, at which point you've got the Luftwaffe to contend with right close to the Luftwaffe forward bases, which is not a good thing for the Royal Navy to try and do, or you've got you're dealing with the Vichy French ports, at which point you attack the Vichy French ports, and the Vichy France formally enters the war on the side of Germany. So that's probably not such a brilliant idea. Jeff 31818 asks, the Second Pacific Squadron versus Warspite. Again, Warspite can just outsail them. Warspite's main risk is running out of ammunition. It can hit further than the Second Pacific Squadron can. It can outrun them. It can just stay at, to be honest, it can stay at 15,000 yards, maybe even closer, be practically immune to anything that's being thrown at it, and just pepper everything with 15-inch fire until either it runs out of 15-inch ammunition, at which point it just leaves, or the Second Pacific Squadron surrenders, whichever comes first. As for why the Royal Navy couldn't use the QE and R class against the German Festung ports like Dunkirk, they could. I mean, Warspite did bombardment duty. One of the R's was sent in as a stealth bombardment vessel against Cherbourg, but a lot of the time, why bother? If the Germans are sort of turtling up in certain port locations, you can just bypass and isolate them. And if you do want to bombard them at some point later on to help take them, well, great. But at the same time, at least once you're talking about the Allied invasion getting going, they obviously wanted to provide as much fire support for the troops as possible, but when it came to ports that were going to be in friendly territory thereafter, like French ports and Dutch ports, whilst, as I say, they would bomb and bombard as much as they felt necessary, they didn't want to just indiscriminately blow the places up, because as compared to what they might have done to some German ports if it had gotten to that, because ultimately you're going to be using those eventually, or sooner if you capture them, and you want to use them for resupply of your own troops. Frank Spazzato says Commander Evans was in the Java Sea battle on USS Alden. Oh, that would be interesting. Thank you, The Legacy, who has managed to capture a bunch of the questions that, for whatever reason, YouTube's chat function just decided to skip a bunch of people. Lazy Life I Freak asks, how far back does the surface torpedo really go in terms of actual torpedo-shaped objects and not fire ships? Surface torpedo as in the self-propelled torpedo. Whitehead's early experiments in the late 1870s and 1880s. Before that, there are torpedoes, but they're what we now would call mines, as opposed to the sort of long torpedo-shaped objects. So yeah, that late 19th century period. Matches burn. How common were illicit stills on larger ships such as cruisers, carriers and battleships, and did they still show up on British ships despite rum being available? Obviously they're a lot more common, and to a certain degree you wouldn't have one on every large ship in the US Navy, but they were relatively common on large ships in navies that ostensibly didn't serve alcohol. On British ships they do turn up occasionally, but the availability of the rum ration generally means that, you know, there's much less of a drive for it. On British ships, you're much more likely to just find stashes of beer or whatever tucked away in various corners, as opposed to a fully operating still, because a stashed away bottle or crate of alcohol is something that people might break out for a specific occasion, and their day-to-day desire for alcohol is met by the grog ration, whereas a still is something really you set up when you want to have a persistent supply and you can't get it otherwise. USS Grey Ghost, how is dental care where you are? Is it still like the Whose Line Is It Anyway joke? Welcome to Britain, next dentist 4 countries over. No, it's not that bad. It can be to a certain extent. It really depends on what kind of dental care you're looking for, and also what economic situation you're in, to be perfectly honest, because so I know this is diverting a bit off of naval history, but he asked. So dental care up till the age of 18 is provided on the NHS. So that's fairly regular treatments, checkups, appointments, etc. After you become an adult, there are still basic treatments, fillings and so forth, basic fillings and stuff that will be provided on the NHS, but you have to register with a private dentist, or I suppose you can try and get an emergency appointment if you don't want to register with a private dentist. But those things can and will be done mostly on the NHS's dime, or penny over here, but there's only a limited range of treatments that will be covered by the NHS for adults at that point. There's other stuff that will be partly subsidised by the NHS, but you'll still have to pay somewhat for. So, for example, I ended up with I had a shattered molar on this side, and also an impacted wisdom tooth, also on this side of my face. And I think the shattered molar, that came out on the NHS. The impacted wisdom tooth, that was a mission and a half, I'll tell you that much, to get it out. That I had to pay a small amount for, but again, most of it was covered by the NHS, and the fact that I kind of said I want this out now, and a few other bits and pieces was all. I think I ended up paying something like 60-80 quid total, and it was done on that day. But, if you want regular checkups, hygiene checks, dental care, etc., you do have to pay for it. And it's not... Okay, I was going to say it's not that expensive. For someone who's on a relatively decent wage, it's not that expensive. It's doable. But I think if you have a large family, if you have 3 or 4 people to cover, it can add up quite quickly. And if you're not on the national average wage, if your household income is below the national average, it's probably something you're going to treat as an ancillary expense. So, 6 of one, half dozen of the other, really. It's basically, can you afford it? Anyway, going back to naval history. Kiflik 2005. How would a fight between Iowa and Yamato differ on a great day with perfect visibility or during night and poor weather conditions? So on a really good day, nice calm seas with perfect visibility, I would argue Yamato probably actually has a certain degree of an advantage, because Yamato's optical fire control system is excellent. Their range on the guns is pretty darn good, and they're able to operate them with relatively good accuracy, as they demonstrated at the Battle of Sumatra, at very long range. So add all that up together, and obviously Iowa can do the same, although probably at very long range, relying more on its radar than on its optical systems. But at that kind of range, Yamato has considerably thicker armor, which has a lot more effect at the longer ranges because of the steeper angle of the shells. And its shells do hit a little bit harder, both in terms of absolute penetration and explosive power. So, good day, perfect visibility, slight advantage Yamato. But then you switch over to the night, or poor visibility, and, Iowa's got its radar, so it can, to a fairly large extent, especially towards the end of the war, ignore those conditions and still fire away, whereas Yamato, towards the end of the war, it has radar, it doesn't have gunnery control radar, so it's almost completely one-sided at that point. Eric 24567, if the Yamatos were rejected and the Kido Butai got more carriers that are designed around the mid-1930s, which pretty much means Shikakus, or derivations thereof, what could Japan have done with even more fleet carriers in the early stages of World War II? Done more damage. I know that sounds a bit trite, but, I mean, they would have had to expand their pilot training program to provide them with enough air groups, which in and of itself would have, had a fairly major effect further down the line. If they've got a larger air training program, that means they can replace pilots a bit faster, which might allow their air groups to maintain their effectiveness for longer periods of time. But you are also going to end up in a situation where you're not going to have that many more, because for the Japanese, their building capability was limited by a number of large slipways. So if they don't have the Yamatos, so Yamato, Musashi, Shinano, well, that's freed up 3 spots to build carriers. And okay, maybe the carriers can be built a bit quicker, so you might have another set on the stocks being constructed, but realistically, you're only going to add at maximum 3 hulls to the Japanese Navy's carrier fleet by the start of World War II. I mean, 3 big Shikaku or Shikaku derivative fleet carriers is a fairly major force, and is definitely going to help them, especially early on, because apart from anything else, if they've got the air groups, then that means a lot more aircraft. They can hit a lot harder at Coral Sea, they can hit a lot harder at Midway, there's more targets to take down. So the early stages of the carrier war probably would have gone a lot more in Japan's favour, but by mid-1943, as more and more Essexes come online, they're still going to be outnumbered, just not quite as badly. Hello, Bradley. Nice to see you again. Colin Cameron said, early self-propelled torpedoes see Mythbusters for 13th century Syrian torpedoes. Well, yeah, I tend to take it from the point of torpedoes as a continuous line of development, as opposed to things that have randomly popped up and then disappeared again, because otherwise you could argue the earliest submarines are way back in like the medieval period, but that's not really, as far as effective naval warfare goes, it's not really an answer. The Legacy has been, I think, has managed to salvage most of the questions that randomly got jumped from the YouTube chat messing up. Paul from Chicago asking, who was angrier, Old Jarvie, Lord St. Vincent, or Admiral King? On their worst days, probably King. St. Vincent had something of a fiery temper, but okay, to be fair, there's a lot more documented about Admiral King because he's a 20th century admiral, not an 18th. But from what I've seen, King was a bit more of a temper on him, which is saying something. So Fushi Smith asks, what's the real story behind Davy Jones and the Flying Dutchman? Does he actually have tentacles and go stalk the seas off the coast of Africa? No, that's Pirates of the Caribbean. There's a lot of different stories behind the origin story for Davy Jones and the Flying Dutchman. Sometimes he's associated with the Flying Dutchman in some stories, in others he's not. Davy Jones' locker is a separate concept to the Flying Dutchman. Usually the Flying Dutchman story, depending on which origin story you choose to believe, but most of them circulate around a captain of some description, usually for some reason going around the South African Cape, caught in a storm, and then basically making a deal with the devil or equivalent thereof in order to preserve his ship from the storm, and thus becoming a cursed vessel destined to haunt the waterways till the end of time. And sometimes, depending on which conflation of legend you're looking at, sometimes that is Davy Jones, other times Davy Jones has his own separate origin story that's completely separate from the Dutchman. So, Packer 910, how did American coal stack up against German and Welsh coal? It depends on where the coal's coming from. America's a big enough country to be blessed with some deposits of pretty decent anthracite coal, and also some deposits of pretty terrible quality coal. So it really depends on which mines you're getting them from. But the average American coal that was supplied to their battle fleet was, so if you're on a 0 to 10 scale, where the absolute best quality anthracite coal is a 9 or a 10, and sort of barely reformed peat is a 0 to 1, German coal is on probably maybe a 3 or a 4 for the stuff that's supplied to the high seas fleet. British coal's usually an 8 or a 9 if it's come from Welsh or North East England mines. And American coal is probably hovers around a 6 or a 7. on average. Maybe push it. Yeah, I'd say that's probably about fair. The best American coal can compete with decent Welsh or North English coal, but because they've got such this wide variety, the best stuff tended to be more expensive and thus held off for other industries rather than just shoveling tens of thousands of tons of it into the US Navy's waiting bunkers. Frank Sposato, what is your favourite ship's crest or shield from World War One, World War Two today, or ever in history? Favourite ship's crest or shield? I'd probably have to go with something from the 1600s, just because they were so hilariously lavish and painted, gilded, decorated and carved. Sovereign of the Seas, for example, the whole point of crests and shields on ships is to be extravagant in the extreme, and Sovereign of the Seas takes a lot of beating in that category. Although, if you move out of the Age of Sail, I am quite partial to the bow ornaments that the US Navy loved to put on their ships in the late 19th century. The Royal Navy also tended to do that as well, but they tended to put them on just for launch and then take them off, whereas there are various photos of US battleships running around with them still attached in regular service, which, they do look very, very impressive. Frank Sposato also asks, if you replace each British ship in the Mediterranean combat with a contemporary American ship, would the US Navy have fared any better or worse during the same time frame? Oh, right, so destroyer-wise, broadly, to be perfectly honest, if you're talking about the main Mediterranean combat, so 40, 41, and then into 42-ish, when everything's a bit up in the air, broadly speaking, actually, the US Navy is going to do significantly worse. And that's on, if you look at things in terms of submarines, destroyers, cruisers, battleships, and carriers. Now, the US Navy will have an advantage, I would say, probably in cruisers, because the Royal Navy, for various reasons, was mostly having to make do with Leanders, Didos, the odd town, York, for as long as York lasted. They didn't really have that many towns there. They had a few, like Gloucester, but not all that many, and few, if any, counties poked their head into the Mediterranean during that period. So they were mostly making do with their lighter, smaller stuff. Now, for the Americans, they don't have that in contemporary shipping. They do have the Omahas, but the Omahas are the equivalent of the C's, D's, and E's, and the Hawkins, and apart from some C-class, those don't really show up in the Mediterranean. So if you're looking at, Leanders, Didos, the towns, that means you're looking at instead Brooklyns, New Orleans, Wichita, maybe the Atlantas. Those would do better. Okay, they don't have torpedoes, which might not help in some circumstances, but the Atlantas are probably going to they will do a much better job of anti-aircraft work than the Didos. At that point, early war, where the 5.25s are still causing some issues. The only caveat to that would be the Didos with the 5.25s with the range can just about hold the line in cruiser actions. The Atlantas really wouldn't be able to, but I think that's going to be more than made up by, instead of having a bunch of Leanders and Didos just floating around, having a bunch of Brooklyns just going, hello, Italian Navy. Have every 6-inch shell ever manufactured on the planet from now until the end of time. And then you have a few heavy cruisers, like one or two heavy cruisers in the background, just occasionally lobbing the odd 8-inch shell in. So yeah, cruiser-wise, the US Navy would do a lot better. Destroyer-wise, they're going to be better able to defend themselves anti-aircraft-wise, but torpedo-wise, you're talking early war, their torpedoes just flat out don't work, and the British destroyers did get some decent use out of their torpedoes in that period, so that would be a a problem. Submarine-wise, again, most of the American submarines are designed for long-range operations in the Pacific. Some of the older boats, S-class, etc., might do... I mean, even the S-class are relatively large. Some of their older stuff might do okay, but big Pacific fleet boats are not going to do well in the Mediterranean. So destroyers probably 6 of one, half dozen of the other, to be honest. But subs they're going to do worse in. Destroyers okay. Cruisers definitely going to have an advantage. Battleships and carriers are where they're going to come a cropper, because contemporary, you're talking about the standards, or what standard, well, 1940, so pre-Pearl Harbor, 1941 as well. But you're talking about a bunch of mostly unupgraded standards, so slow, especially, I mean, even compared to, I think they're probably contemporary to the R's in speed, but the QEs, even Barham and Malaya have probably got a knot or two on them, and obviously Warspite, Queen Elizabeth and Valiant have got a couple, 2-3 knots on them. So they're not going to be as fast, because they haven't gone through the modernizations that Warspite, QE and Valiant have done. They're not going to have the AA firepower. They're not going to have the torpedo defense. I mean, they've got guns, but so do the British ships. So overall, battleship-wise, they're going to be a lot more limited. You're not going to get something like Calabria or Matapan out of the US ships, because they're just never going to get there. Aircraft carrier-wise, this is another area they're going to do a lot more poorly in. In 1940, their air groups are not anything much to write home about. And by 41, you're beginning to see Wildcats and Dauntlesses come in. And yes, they do have larger air groups, but the sheer scope and scale of the attacks that the Italians and the Germans can throw at them is an order of magnitude beyond what the Japanese can throw at them in the Pacific, and sustained attacks as well. So, Coral Sea or Midway, there's a day of fighting, maybe a day and a bit, and then that's it. Both sides have either lost enough aircraft or lost enough ships, or both, that one or the other is dropping back. Whereas you look at the Mediterranean operations, it's day after day after day after day of attacks. Hundreds upon hundreds of sorties being flown, and okay, maybe an individual attack by Fliegerkorps 10 or the Italians might be 30, 40, 50 aircraft on the par with a large Kido Butai strike, but then the Kido Butai, say, does that for one day and then goes away. Whereas the Italians and Fliegerkorps 10, they'll hit you with that one day, then they'll hit you with that the next day, and the next, and the next, and the next. That's going to wear you down quite quickly, and with the best will in the world, if some lucky Ju-87 pilot puts a 1,000-pound or 2,000-pound bomb into a US Yorktown class, which again would be contemporary to the armoured carriers, that's it. I mean, you look at what a 550-pounder did to Yorktown at Coral Sea. A 1,000-pounder, 2,000-pounder, no. Especially in the places, if you look at where ships like Illustrious were hit, and then translate that into those bombs hitting, except now they're going through basically unprotected flight deck and being triggered at the level of the hangar deck instead, it's game over at that point. So overall, their capital ship side of things, the US Navy would do worse, which will affect their control of the seas. They'll have more aircraft kills as a whole, most likely, and say the cruiser actions will go their way, but the cruisers aren't going to be all that much help. They're going to be doing the same kind of thing as the British cruisers did when Vittorio Veneto or Littorio shows up on the horizon, because run the other way. Might take out a few Italian cruisers though, so yeah. Fushi Smith, what is the deal with sea monsters on old maps? Were they actually Krakens and such grabbing ships and pulling them under? In some ways, it's just a case of marking, edge of map, don't know what's here, probably put something dangerous to indicate that, this is a dangerous area, probably not a good idea to go there. Part of it is also just the artwork of the people who are conducting these things, because some of the stuff that they're drawing is supposed to be relatively simple stuff like whales, but it's being drawn in a in the hilarious manner of people of the time who have only ever got third-hand descriptions of these creatures. I mean, you look at some of the period taxidermy of animals like lions, or paintings of animals like elephants and giraffes that, again, the artist has heard of third hand but never seen anything close to an actual example of, and you'd be hard pressed to figure out what the heck it was unless someone pointed out and told you, yeah, this is supposed to be a lion or a giraffe or a camel or whatever. So it's a mixture of that plus, as I say, effectively a kind of danger, keep out, except in map form. Plus, to a certain degree, and not that I want to overblow it, but the seas were a lot richer back then. Now, I'm not necessarily saying there was a bunch of sea monsters out there that we nowadays don't have because they went extinct or they've gone into hiding or something. But what for these days would be a non-entity, so like a giant or a colossal squid showing up these days to a modern container ship or a large mature whale, for that matter, for a modern container ship or warship is like, oh, cool, that's a thing. For a ship that only weighs 60 tons or something like that, or a Viking longship or something like that, an angry colossal, dying colossal squid on the surface could be a legitimate threat to life and limb. An angry whale certainly could be. So there was a different scale of threat involved there as well. John Hart says, Professor Andrew Lambert recently argued for a Royal Navy operation in the Baltic in World War I to blockade Swedish imports, causing a German defeat, thus no need for a large army on the Western Front. Was this feasible? Depends what they're using it for. I'd have to see what his argument is, because Professor Lambert, obviously, he didn't get to be the Lawton Professor of History for no reason. He usually knows what he's talking about, but I would have to see the video or lecture or book where he's making that argument, because if you're talking about early 1916 using the battle fleet to do it, then no, it's not feasible, because you've got the entire high seas fleet who'll come and try and stop you, and plenty of U-boats. If you're talking about perhaps using submarines to do it, that's a different story. If you're talking about using the Grand Fleet to do it in 1918 when German high seas fleet morale is at rock bottom, that's another matter entirely. If you're talking about using some other balance of forces in, say, 1914, 1915, it's another matter entirely. So I'd have to have a further look in and see what precisely the time period and the ships that are being argued for actually are. Matt Clem asks, for the invasion of Japan, were there any plans or designs for temporary harbour facilities such as the Mulberry at Normandy? I don't know, actually. Personally, I would suspect not, because of the distances involved and the sheer scale of the landing operations. They almost certainly would have gone to capture a port as fast as humanly possible. But it's possible they might have been looking into that kind of stuff. Yeah, I do need to look into a bit more about Operation Downfall, because it's the general scale and logistics, expected casualties and stuff like that I have looked into, but some of the more detailed plans, if such existed, I haven't looked into as much. Shelling French ports, yes, I've done that one. Carriers. Ryan Frederick, what is a reasonable rate of fire for battleship main guns, era of steam and steel, through history? Reasonable rate of fire, i.e. in battle? For World War One and World War Two, usually you're looking at about one salvo every minute or so, i.e. one every 60 seconds. Now, yes, in theory, ships can do one round, sort of each gun can fire a round every 30 seconds or 35 seconds or something thereabouts. Occasionally, one or two ships like Bismarck can, in theory, do faster. But one, Bismarck's loading systems, if you ran them full pelt, had an irritating habit of breaking down. And two, as I've said before in other videos, you know, if your shelf light time is 25 seconds, there's no point in having another shell ready to go 5 seconds after that shell's landed, because it's going to take you longer than that to plug in the necessary corrections to your fire control solution, which is why, amongst other things, they tended to fire half salvos, because then you could do that. You'd fire your first half salvo, and then maybe 30 seconds later your next half salvo, or a decent period of time between, maybe 10, 15, 30 seconds, and then you'd observe the fall, and they'd be aimed at slightly different points, so different falls of shot would be observed, and then you could observe the first one, and you'd be making corrections to your first half salvo whilst someone else is still looking out for the fall of shot from the second one, and that doubles up on the rate at which you can gather information. But the overall sort of rate of fire per whole broadside is usually around about a salvo per minute. That only really changes once they're pretty confident they've established the range and they're just blazing away as fast as possible, or occasionally if they're just trying to blaze away as fast as humanly possible to get as many data points as possible. But normally you'd expect a reasonable rate of fire to be about 1 round per minute per gun. For World War One, World War Two. The further back you go through the era of steam and steel back into the late Ironclad age, obviously that starts to grow quite quickly. So Battle of Tsushima, you're probably looking at a round every 2 to 3 minutes for the big guns, if you're lucky. Depending on the gun crews and the ship, obviously, it could be faster, it could be slower. And then once you get much before that, in kind of the 1880s, 1890s, you're talking about multiple minutes, if not even measuring in fractions of an hour per round. Initial driver, who made the best armor plating in World War II? Depends on what ship and depends on how you're quantifying it. So if you are looking at battleship armor in terms of material makeup and face hardening level, thickness level, then the British make the best. If you're looking at cruiser grade armor in terms of material quality and face hardening thickness, either the Americans or the Italians. If you're looking for consistent armor, i.e. whose armor is going to protect you the best for a given thickness, given level of quality across the entire spectrum, probably the Italians, because they have variable thicknesses on their face hardening as a percentage of depth, as compared to everybody else who tended to have fixed depths. So the Italian armor would have the most consistent protective performance across the board in terms of overall resistive power. The American cruiser armor was the toughest cruiser armor. British battleship armor per inch was the toughest battleship armor, and also the British and Germans had the best material mix for their armor. So yeah, it is a little bit all over. So then of course you've got the Japanese, who obviously make the thickest armor. So it's all over. Basically pick a ship and what do you want it to do. Are you looking at a cruiser? Are you looking at a battleship, a battle cruiser? The answer's all going to be a mix up there. Chloe Hennessy says, my favourite ship is USS Atlanta, but lately I've been using HMS Belfast and wiping the deck with people in game. These two ships go head to head. Who wins? At range, Belfast. The 6-inch guns range out further, hit harder, and Belfast is bigger and has actual protection, so it can soak up a bit more damage. So at long to medium ranges, Belfast will take it, but if it gets down to kind of knife fighting ranges, then the sheer volume of fire that Atlanta can put out will probably allow it to wreck enough of Belfast to make Belfast's ability to return fire somewhat ineffectual. Mark Bass, It asks, do you think an Iowa class and her 16-inch guns could be modified enough to put shells into orbit and take out satellites? In theory, I think the US did at one point actually experiment with, I believe it was, they basically stacked two 16-inch guns on top of each other and tried to see if you could fire satellites into space. So in theory, if they were moored on the dock side and you did a lot of modifications to allow the turrets to fire 80 or 90 degrees, and you basically copied that stack gun one on top of the other, then yeah, possibly you could turn the Iowas into a floating anti-satellite platform. But in terms of using that whole setup at sea, no. In terms of using the gun turrets as they exist, no, because they don't elevate that far. And in terms of, yeah, it was one of these, technically yes, but practically no, because the minute you get underway with like a 120 caliber 16-inch gun, it's just going to start wobbling and bending like a pool noodle. Except unlike a pool noodle, it won't go back. So, yeah. Thomas Hobarth, if the Kriegsmarine would somehow have been able to realise Plan Z before the war broke out and face off against the Royal Navy as it was in 1940, how would this affect the Battle of the Atlantic? If they'd somehow managed to get everything they wanted for Plan Z before the war broke out, it would be a major problem. But to be honest, one of the biggest issues there would be in 1940, they'd be able to sortie once and then they'd be out of fuel. I think it would have a much bigger effect when they still have the fuel on the invasion of Norway. It would make the invasion of Norway even more one-sided for the Germans, because they'd have loads of ships. They'd be able to just blanket the place and affect sea superiority. But, yeah, once it comes to actually trying to fight out into the Battle of the Atlantic, I mean, the Royal Navy would be forced to concentrate its forces a lot more to face off against the Plan Z plan. And they may even be at a disadvantage in 1940 because obviously the whole Z plan means an entirely modern fleet. But at that point, their solution, to be honest, the Royal Navy's best solution at that point would just be to, call a halt to the convoys, take the hit to supplies on the land for a few weeks, and let the mass German fleet sail randomly around the Atlantic till it runs out of fuel and has to go back to harbour, because they're probably not going to have the fuel to do that again, which kind of solves the problem for them. But yeah, if the Royal Navy, if the home fleet such as it was in 1940 tried to face off against the entire Z plan, then obviously they're going to lose, but the home fleet wouldn't have been what it was in 1940. Chazek asks, Great White Fleet versus all British pre-dreadnoughts. Well, that's kind of another way around. The Great White Fleet was good. It was big and strong and powerful, but it didn't compare to the number of pre-dreadnoughts the British had. The British had pre-dreadnoughts everywhere. When the Great White Fleet sailed through the Mediterranean, there were almost as many British pre-dreadnoughts, if not as many, generally in the Mediterranean as there were ships in the Great White Fleet, and that's not counting for the pre-dreadnoughts on foreign stations, the ones in the British Atlantic Fleet, the ones in the British at the time Channel fleets and home fleets. Yeah, if you stack all the British pre-dreadnoughts together, they outnumber the Great White Fleet quite considerably. And then Initial Driver asking, replacing the 2nd Pacific Squadron with the US Navy at Tsushima. 1905. They'd probably win. By 1905, I think the US Navy's actually built enough pre-dreadnoughts to... And they've got also... oh no, they don't. By 1905, they don't quite have the Pennsylvanias and Tennessees in hand. They're under construction. But they've probably got enough modern pre-dreadnoughts to outnumber Togo. And they've got some cruisers, nothing brilliant to write home about at that point. Oh, they've got Brooklyn and New York and Texas for the armoured cruisers, I guess. It'd be a close fight in 1905 because you've still got the Connecticuts under construction. You've still got the last big classes of US pre-dreadnoughts under construction. And as I say, the Tennessees and Pennsylvanias aren't there yet. But they certainly give a hell of a tough fight. I'd have to add up the exact numbers, but it could go either way. ballparking it at this point. Daniel Taylor asking, did you shatter the molar after eating a ship's biscuit? Bit of a callback to earlier. Thank you, Chloe Hennessy, by the way. No, the molar got shattered years and years and years and years ago, and then got filled in, and then the filling eventually deteriorated, which is why it had to eventually come out. That got shattered because I bought a sandwich at the seaside, and what must have happened is, because it's quite a windy day, a bit of small bit of grit or gravel got blown into it whilst it was being made, or possibly while I was holding it in its paper. So I bit into it, clamped down with my teeth, and bit what appeared to be a bit of granite chipping instead. And it turns out that my teeth are not stronger than granite chipping, but my bite force is stronger than my teeth when it comes to biting on that kind of stuff. And the thing just went poof. Yeah, it's split into I think 3 major parts, one of which was just basically the facing, which was then all kind of patched back together with filling material, and eventually that degraded and the front face fell off, and that was it. Knight 6831, could the L and M class destroyer conversion to Type 62 air defense frigates have worked? Yeah. In theory, to a certain degree, but to be perfectly honest, they're not big enough. This is one of the problems. I mean, even the gearings, large though they are for World War II destroyers, are really still too small for conversion into any kind of meaningful anti-aircraft missile craft in this Cold War. And the LNMs are smaller than that. So, I think probably got maybe another half hour-ish on this. So, let's see how we go. John Rodriguez, the gun test for suborbital projectiles was Project Harp. Yeah. Right. Scooter JSP. In the Pearl Harbor salvage videos, you mentioned that several Type 91 torpedoes were recovered intact. Did the US attempt to reverse engineer these for useful offensive or defensive data? Not as far as I'm aware. They did have a look at them, obviously, but when the things they've run their fuel out, then an air tank is an air tank is an air tank. They don't necessarily know that they've got liquid oxygen in there, and the explosive warhead's not anything particular to write home about. And bear in mind also they're convinced at this point that the Mark 14 actually works. So I think by the time they actually realise the Mark 14 isn't working and fix it, they are also. They're also beginning to realise the capabilities of Japanese torpedoes. Archangel Glenn, assuming all crews are equal, who would win, Yugamo, Fletcher, or Javelin? In a gunfight, Fletcher, most likely. In a gunfight, a Fletcher would probably win. In a purely torpedo fight, obviously a Yugamo would win. It's got by far the largest numbers of torpedoes. The Javelin's kind of a nice mix in between. So basically in a torpedo fight, Fletcher will come off worst, Yugamo best. In a gunfight, Yugamo will come off worst and Fletcher best. Javelin's going to be kind of the middleman. So Javelin stands a chance of winning either engagement, but is at a disadvantage against the most likely candidate. Matt Clem says the US Navy requested the addition of tunnels to the Chesapeake Bay Bridge tunnel to prevent a downed bridge from trapping the fleet. Can you think of similar considerations and structures for other harbours? Yes, to a certain degree, there's a reason there's no bridge connecting Portsmouth and Gosport, even though the distance is not actually that great. And in a large part, that's because the Royal Navy needs to get in and out of Portsmouth, and has done for a very long period of time. There's quite a number of places in the UK where either bridges haven't been built, or if they have been built, they've been forced to be built with some kind of lifting or otherwise moving capacity, or at very great heights, in order to accommodate ships coming in and out of the place. Of course, even then there are certain limitations, like with the Forth Bridge, the Queen Elizabeths have to lower the uppermost parts of their masts to get in, and even then go in at low tide because they were built more than high enough to get most things in and out at the time. They just, now ships are a lot bigger, so it's all over the place with that. Battleship 61 says, "Hello Jack, it's me again." Hello. If the Francesco Caracciolo class battleships were built and maintained until World War II, would these pose a much larger threat for British forces, and thus they would bring more warships into the Mediterranean? Yes, quite a lot. So things like the Dulios and Cavours, they're good modernizations, but they are still modernizations of old ships with smaller guns. So the Italians, they got decent turn of speed out of them, but the Italians knew that their armour was not sufficient to stand up to 15-inch guns at anything like normal battle ranges. And their own guns, while they rebored them to 12.6, they also knew that, okay, they could hit, but they're not the world's best guns, but it's the best that they can do. Primarily, obviously, these things are designed to counter, the refits were designed more to counter the Dunkirks than any British ships. And that's one of the reasons why Giulio Cesare backs off at Calabria when Warspite hits her. Whereas if you've got the Caracciolo's, they had a baseline speed that was going to be much higher anyway. And of course, they've got 15-inch guns and better armour, so if they do modernise them, which they probably will, then they are going to be much, much more capable units, because they're going to be fast, heavily armed. Who knows, their shells might even work, and decently armoured. So yeah, they would effectively be, in some ways, what the Queen Elizabeths had been hoped to be, or potentially could have been with small tube boilers, plus the modernizations. They would have been far, far, far more dangerous than something like Giulio Cesare or Conte de Cavour. Trains Kings. Out of all the dreadnoughts produced, which ones would fit these descriptions? Oddball, Agincourt, Unloved, and Ugly Duckling also include ones that were paper designs. Yeah, Oddball would be Agincourt. Unloved. That's a good one. Unloved, and very unloved vessel. I don't know which battleships would particularly fall under unloved. Ugly Duckling. Well, they say beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I can guarantee you the strongest sentiments in terms of being ugly ducklings is probably going to be expressed about Nelson and Rodney. I personally don't believe it. I think they look fairly decent, but I know a lot of people have some very strong opinions otherwise. Frank Sposato, how difficult would it be to search for the other ships in the Solomons resting at about 2,500 feet, just 20 miles from shore? Not too difficult if you've got something like RV Petrel, but I mean, in the grand scheme of things, searching for wrecked ships in the depths underwater is not easy by any stretch of the imagination. But with an experienced crew and a ship as well equipped as the Petrel, you probably stand a half decent chance of finding them. It's just unfortunate at the moment it doesn't look like Petrel's going anywhere anytime soon. Visual Don, is there a Midway 2019 review coming soon? You mentioned it in your chat with John Parshall. It is coming at some point later this year. I'm a little bit... I mean, I did this with Chris from Military Aviation History and Justin. I'm just a little bit low. I do want to put it up. I do want to put it up this year. It's just with my experiences so far with the U571 review, and the various copyright issues floating around about that, and potential impacts because the flipping people who don't understand fair use are still trying to hold it over me. I'm just a little bit gun shy about putting something like that up without a long period of lead in. And so yeah, it will probably come, but I think I am first I want to sort out this U571 business and retain that legal advice before I put up the Midway thing. Either that, or someone invites me to Nebula or something like that, and I'll put both of them up there, one way or the other, and then obviously link it for everybody. Basically just find a service that will host them that isn't quite as silly about things as YouTube can be at times. Good evening, Colin's Dad one. Initial Driver asks, what if Mers-el-Kébir never happened? That's a big one. If Mers-el-Kébir never happened, everything is on a little bit of a knife edge at that time. There are certainly officers in the French Navy who are much more sympathetic to the British cause and to fighting alongside Britain. There are other officers who want nothing more to do with it and just want to basically they'll just obey what the Vichy government says because they believe it's the rightful government of France. So I think Mers-el-Kébir really does crystallise things in a lot of ways, and it probably does actually compromise a number of French vessels' ability-desire to fight alongside the British. I mean, when you look at things like the Vichy regime replaced several key officers, especially some of those who were in charge of Richelieu, specifically because even after Mers-el-Kébir, they were worried that some of those officers would take Richelieu and sail out and join the British. So, without Mers-el-Kébir happening, I think there's a strong possibility that a number of the French vessels, including perhaps Richelieu, might well defect to the British. The flip side to that is that, with the French fleet largely otherwise intact, the British are going to have nightmares about them consistently for pretty much the rest of the war up until sort of Toulon alternate timeline. Plus, also, there may be more of them sitting in places like Casablanca. Captain Seafort making a good point. Unloved the R class. They all seem to get dismissed as the poor man's QE. Yeah, for World War II, you're probably right. Frank Sposato. You've asked that. I did mention that one. Nihon asks, what tactics did U-boats develop after Black May? So presumably this is the 1943... So OS-55 convoy battle. So the Wolfpack tactics would continue to evolve. It was very much a back and forth. Some of the U-boat tactics would involve things like a single U-boat acting as a backstop. So they would try and detect in some manner or receive reports of detection of a British convoy, whether that be from Condors or other U-boats or whatever, and then they'd sit further back and broadcast those messages to all the U-boats in the Wolfpack that would be further forward, to try and effectively keep themselves safe because they're far enough away from the convoy, and then also keep the more forward operating U-boats safe because they're not having to transmit. Obviously, once they got acoustic homing torpedoes, they tried to take out the escorts. Initially, you'd also have things like U-boats that would make a big song and dance up front, get all the convoys, get all the convoy escorts to come out to them. Then they'd dive deep before the escort showed up, and just try and creep along underneath and past them, and then pop up in the middle of the convoy or behind the convoy and hit them from behind. Yeah, if you have a look at the videos I did on the Western Approaches Command, I do discuss this a lot when I talk about the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, WWII, because it was a constant back and forth of tactics. The U-boats would develop something and it would work fairly well for a few weeks or a few months, and then WWII would come up with counter tactics, and then those would work really well for a few weeks or a few months, and then a new counter would be developed, and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Corey S pointing out YouTube's just passing the copyright claim on to me. Yeah, but they're also the one who is blocking it. Because YouTube don't want to get involved in the process at all. They just take they basically just take the claimant's claim at face value, so that YouTube won't look at the merits of both sides and go, actually no, this is blatantly a fair use review, get stuffed. They leave it on me to challenge them, and then if they choose to throw that challenge back in my face, I basically have to make a formal legal representation, which then the next stage, if the other guys choose to counter that, then potentially I get a formal copyright strike on the channel, or it goes even further, and then then you have to get into proper solicitors fees engagements and everything, which just isn't worth it. So yeah, I'm awaiting the outcome of some further legal advice on the U571 stuff, but I may, depending on how things go, I may just go, you know what, I'll black out the 3 or 4 minutes of footage that they're demanding, just so that the whole thing can be there and people will understand what that blacked out section means. Yeah, Visual Dawn. I mean, the other thing is, who owns the various copyrights? Because Studio Canal are the people who are being problematic for the U571 review, whereas they may not. I don't think they're anything to do with the Midway movie, and a lot of it comes down to which of the movie producers. Some of them are a lot better about recognizing reviews than others. I think, to be honest, Studio Canal apparently have a history of being very, very problematic with the whole sort of fair use and reviews aspect, and they're apparently very prickly when people criticize their films for being bad, at which point, stop making bad movies, then we won't criticize them. I'm just going to put that back. Right. Initial driver asking, Triton class submarine versus Trench class, pros and cons. I'm presuming you mean the Royal Navy T class versus the Tench class. If I remember correctly, the Tench class is either very late war or immediately post-war. Let me just double check. Yes, yeah. So the Tenches are 1944 onwards. So, T class, which is what I'm presuming you mean by Triton class. Let me just double check. Triton class. Yes, T class, British T class sub. So, the T class are good fleet boats. I will always stand by that. But, the Tench class is a very late World War II design. The T class is a pre-World War II design. So the Tench class is going to be able to dive further, go faster, go further, carry more torpedoes. Pretty much the only thing that the T class is going to have over the Tench is the initial spread. The T class, it's very difficult to beat the T class's ability to just throw 10 torpedoes at you and then skedaddle. But yeah, that kind of comparison, that's pretty much the only pro in the T class's favour, which isn't surprising given the the time and technological difference between the two. Dexter Sample, what kind of threat would a Montana pose to the navies of the World War II time period? I mean, on its own, not much of one. It basically would be like the Yamato. It's a big threat, but it's a single target that can be picked off by large numbers of other ships or planes. If it's built into the centerpiece of a task group by one of the larger navies, well, then obviously it'll have a lot of heavy AA and be very well defended. It's yeah. I mean, the Montanas are big and scary in a surface engagement, but to be honest, apart from in a surface engagement, when it comes to carrier escort, they're slower than the Iowas. When it comes to AA, for 28-knot ships armed with 16-inch guns, you've already got the South Dakotas and the North Carolinas when they're not vibrating in the later part of the war. And their AA battery isn't going to be that much better than the North Carolinas or the South Dakotas compared to their costs. Most of the Montana's additional cost justification comes from their ability to fight surface action, but by the time they come into service, what surface actions are they going to fight? So, yeah, I mean, in a one-on-one fight, sure, Montana's a massive threat to everything up to and including the Yamato, but on a strategic level, it's a battleship. Thomas van der Velde asking why I reviewed or analysed U571. It was the highest voted option on the Patreon poll, relevant Patreon poll that month, so I had to do it. Amnuk saying, read the Mulberry and Japanese invasions. Where would they build the sections? Doesn't have a short. Yeah, that's one of the main problems. You could build. I mean, in theory, you could build them on one of the nearby islands, but even then, nearby island to Japan that's been captured by the Allies is still a heck of a lot further than across the Channel. Tim S says the Congo built as a battlecruiser but rebuilt as a fast battleship. I disagree. I do disagree with that. The Congos got faster. They got slightly better armed in terms of refitting the non-14-inch battery and some upgrades to what the 14-inch guns could do, but they fundamentally didn't change its armor. They got a few minor upgrades to deck armor, but ultimately, it's still got battle cruiser grade armor. It's got fast speed. So what defines a fast battleship? Well, speed. Well, fast battleships and battle cruisers are both quick. Firepower. Well, firepower is firepower. It's a heavily armed battle cruiser, a lightly armed battleship, 6 of one, half dozen of the other. But what really distinguishes a battle cruiser from a battleship is, for the most part, armor, and they didn't upgrade Congo's armor, which did come back to bite it. Well, bite Kirishima quite badly, and actually bite Hiei as well. So yeah, I don't really agree with claims that the Congos were battleships. People call them that, but I just don't think they are. Frank Spazzato, World War II starts in 1949. Who wins, and would you still cover it? Probably. I'd probably still cover it because, the implementation of and realization of carrier-based air power and missiles would have been dragged out a little bit by not having the crucible of World War II to develop those ideas and tactics in. As far as who wins, well, who are the sides in 1949? Who's joining the war on which side and when? Because at that point, the Allies are going to win, because Germany might, I mean, okay, they've actually abandoned the Z plan, but even before World War II breaks out. But even assuming for some reason they try and stick it out with the Z plan, Germany doesn't have the fuel reserves or the infrastructure to actually build and support it. So their naval expansion is going to keel over and die at some point in probably the early 40s. The British can sustain the Lions and the Implacables and the follow-ons to the Lions and so on and so forth. So the British will have modernised their fleet, disposed of the R's, etc., probably even disposed of the QEs. The Americans, likewise, they'll have a modernised fleet, modernised carriers. The Japanese will probably have a fairly formidable fleet with their Circle 5 and Circle 6 plans, but probably would also have run out of oil by then. So, you know, if a war starts in 1949, the only ones who are probably going to have their head above the parapet in terms of being able to actually offer a substantial amount of resistance are going to be the Italians, because the Italians will have just been husbanding what fuel they've got and building up their fleet, whereas the Germans will be looking at a half-completed fleet and little fuel, and the Japanese will be looking at a fairly large, fairly capable completed fleet and even less fuel. Whereas the British and the Americans were going, well, we've modernised all our entire fleets and we have so much oil it's embarrassing. Scooter JSP, what's your favourite story about military personnel performing unauthorised field modifications to their ships, aircraft or equipment? Probably the stories I heard from Commander Steve George about the absolute gutting of the reserve fleet that various Royal Navy crew did in the run-up to to the Falklands. Basically ripping out all of the designed for 14 days operation before being replaced elements of the newer Royal Navy ships, and just going aboard like Lion and Blake, also Tiger and Blake, and various other reserve and decommissioned ships, and just stripping out things like refueling lines, AA guns, basically anything they thought might be decent and can be moved. It's like the Royal Navy fleet that went down to the Falklands was probably 30% quote-unquote obsolete equipment by volume. Just so happened that stuff actually worked, as opposed to the quote-unquote modern stuff which the various ships had been equipped with, but that probably would have broken down and got everyone hopelessly lost during the war. Um, 351XBE 1973. How much naval power did Britain commit to the Pacific campaign in the early to mid-war years? In the very, very early war years, not much. They were actually drawing down their fleet commitment because obviously they weren't at war with Japan. They were at war with Germany and then later Italy. Then come the actual, war with Japan, they put Repulse and Prince of Wales in there. That didn't go very well. They had a scattering of cruisers and destroyers in the area under ABDA command. That also didn't go very well. They then actually put a fairly substantial force in the Indian Ocean, the 4 R's, Warspite, 2 armoured carriers, bunch of cruisers, including a couple of counties, Dorsetshire and Cornwall. That also didn't go very well. They lost Hermes, Cornwall, Dorsetshire, a few other ships. And then they drew back the more useful ships, the carriers and Warspite. The R's spent a bit of time pottering around the Western Indian Ocean for a bit. And then as you get into the sort of full-on mid-war period, 1943-ish, they send Victorious to help out the US, but broadly speaking, British naval commitment to the Pacific War is relatively minimal through 43 and early 44. But then with late 43, as the Italians bow out of the war, the Eastern Fleet starts to get built up again, and then obviously towards late 44 becomes the British Pacific Fleet and starts to become pretty large. Thomas Hobarth, do you plan to make a video on SMS Koenig? Yes, if I haven't done so already. Trains King. Which admiral from each side of World War One and World War Two had the most swag? Well, World War One probably, unfortunately, Beatty, because that's probably all he had. World War Two, I don't know. I don't know. Oh, that's a good question, actually, in World War Two. Not sure. Initial driver says the T-class has the only sub versus sub kill, though, advantage. Well, yeah, but that's more of a captain and crew thing than a specific sub thing. Visual Dawn, Midway is by Lionsgate. Thank you, Visual Dawn. Yeah, I will get that Midway review up at some point this year. There's so many things I've got to do. I'll get to it. It'll be long, though. Put it this way. Where are we? It's 1946 UK time, hilariously enough. Okay, so we'll give it the last few minutes. We'll get up to 1950, which is also where the channel's coverage finishes. So another 4 minutes, and then, well, I've got to wrap up because I've got to go and find some bats, which is going to be fun. Okay, her Hornbuckler asks how far is the concept of fast battleships better than battlecruisers in terms of sacrificing armor and armament for speed? Basically, fast battleships come about because of advances in propulsion technology. The battleship, obviously, the battleship emphasizes firepower and armor above speed. The battlecruiser goes for speed first, and then firepower, and then armor, generally speaking. Although the German ones perhaps switch around those last two a little bit. But this was in a good part because you had to make that choice. You couldn't go. You couldn't get a battleship that could do, in say World War One, you couldn't get a battleship that could do the high 20s of knots and have decent armor and have decent firepower. When you got small tube boilers, you could. And the small tube boiler revolution is kind of, this is why you start to see things in the immediate post-war. The Japanese are kind of starting with the Amagi and the Ki and Tosa, etc. They're starting to blend the concept of the battleship and the battle cruiser together into what you call a fast battleship, albeit with possibly questionably thinner armor than is otherwise healthy. And then the British, you've got like the G3s, which are battle cruisers only compared to the N3s. By every other standard, the G3s will be considered fast battleships. And then once you get into the 1930s, when the treaty battleships start to come under construction, the propulsion technology has now, and to a certain extent, shipbuilding technology, has advanced to the point where you can get a battleship that can now move at speeds around that of a World War I battle cruiser, i.e. 28-ish knots, and still possess, good firepower and decent armor. But then you start to see, battle cruisers, through a combination of refits and a few legacy ships and a few proposed ships, then, there are some battle cruiser designs that push the envelope out even further. So they're pushing up to sort of 33, 34 knots, whereas the battleships are 28 knots, whereas before it had been 21, 23 knots, and the battle cruisers doing 26 to 28 knots. In a lot of ways, Iowa is similar, not identical, but similar in concept to Hood, because Hood was Queen Elizabeth level protection, Queen Elizabeth firepower, but fast. And Iowa is, South Dakota level protection, initially South Dakota level firepower, then they upgraded to the 50 caliber 16-inch guns, but fast. And Iowa's definitely a fast battleship, and there's as I've said before, pretty good argument to say that the Hood is also a fast battleship. Christopher asks, how far back in history would you have to travel to make a realistic change that ends with Germany being at least equal to the UK in naval power in World War One or World War Two? For World War Two, you'd have to somehow engineer it so that the UK loses World War One. To be equal to the UK in naval power in World War One, that is somewhat easier to do if you don't have someone like Fisher doing the sweeping reforms that he does in the early part of the 1900s, scrapping a bunch, literally dozens or hundreds of obsolete Royal Navy vessels, thus saving a lot of money and crew, and pushing through, reforms and new ship designs. Then the Royal Navy could very well have been caught on the hop a little bit when dreadnoughts start coming out, which could have allowed the Germans to get a little bit of a leg up in the dreadnought race. And if the Royal Navy's saddled with a lot of expenses still running old ships, that could have held back the Royal Navy's ability to build newer ships. So they would have had to do a late scrappage scheme, a late start. They'd have to then be playing catch up with the Germans. Sure, they could, but with the complete mess that would probably result in, that would probably drag everything out even further. So, that might result in an approximately equal level of dreadnoughts at the start of World War One. And as I said, the closest the Germans had for a chance of vaguely coming off best against the Grand Fleet probably was 1914, because the Germans didn't have that many ships left to finish. The British did. So as 1914 and the 1915 war on, the Grand Fleet's advantage got bigger and bigger. TMS Congo was improved vertical and horizontal. They didn't improve the main belt thickness of the Congos. I can guarantee you that. They might have put a little bit more extensive armor, but Congo still had 8-inch maximum thickness belt. There's no records of them taking that armor off and supplement and making it 9, 10, 11, 12 inches. Michael O'Brien, had CV6 been built as a midway class with 1930s technology, planes and weapons, how could that have affected the early war? Would have made it a fairly big target for the Japanese. It might change up who's deployed to Coral Sea, because if you've got a 1930s era midway, you probably don't want to send your now centerpiece carrier as the escort to Hornet for the Doolittle raid. You probably send Yorktown as the escort and instead send Enterprise with Lexington to Coral Sea. Now, obviously, that's more aircraft, but potentially also, if it takes the same kind of crippling hit that Yorktown did. Although, actually, no, Midway, if you're talking about specifically a Midway, I'll have an armoured flight deck, so it wouldn't be hurt by the hit that hit Yorktown. It'll just bounce off the armoured flight deck, not do a lot of damage. So, probably do a bit more damage to the Japanese at Coral Sea, and then at the Battle of Midway itself, again, slightly more aircraft, hit the Japanese slightly harder. Enterprise at that point doesn't get damaged at Midway, so the additional durability doesn't matter too much. And then in the Guadalcanal campaign, it'll probably again last longer, because 550-pound bomb hits is mostly what was causing problems on Enterprise. And if they hit the armoured flight deck of a Midway, it's going to be okay, well, there's a small hull, too bad, so sad, never mind, keep going. Right. Well, we've gone into 1954. So I do have to start wrapping this up, because I do have places to be in half an hour. Let's see. Let's get 3 more questions, and then we'll wrap up. If the USA stays neutral, what's the naval outlook in World War One and World War Two? In World War One, the single biggest problem with the US staying neutral is probably the U-boat campaign. They might have to strip the Grand Fleet of destroyers, or at least a couple of destroyer flotillas, to make up for that, which is a bit of a risk, but the naval outlook for World War One, if they do, as long as they do that, it's probably not too awful. For if the US stays neutral. World War Two, it's a lot more of a problem because the Royal Navy can handle the Kriegsmarine and the Regimarine, most likely without direct US naval intervention, and in because Lend-Lease and stuff can still happen with the US staying neutral. Excuse me. Japan is the much bigger problem in World War II because the Royal Navy on its own is going to have its handful dealing with the European theatre. Then they're not going to have much of anything to deal with the Japanese Navy if the US is staying absolutely neutral. Although that does beg the question of what is Japan doing if the US is neutral? It's probably not going to go. Well, you know, the Americans aren't going to take Pearl Harbor lying down, so that implies that Pearl Harbor doesn't happen. If Pearl Harbor doesn't happen, then do the Japanese attack the Philippines? If the Japanese don't attack the Philippines, what, do they just go straight for the Dutch East Indies? That would be a very big play on their part. More likely, kind of... And, of course, Hitler declared war on the US. The US didn't declare war on Germany, although it was probably coming anyway. So, if the US is neutral during World War II, that probably implies that Japan is not taking an active part in the Pacific War. So, if they're not, well, it's probably just a European conflict. The Italians bow out in 1943, Kriegsmarine gets crushed. Yeah, it basically rides on what does Japan do. If Japan is neutral and the USA is neutral, it's probably better for the Royal Navy because the losses they suffer against Japan don't happen. If Japan still somehow launches a campaign in the Pacific but the US stays neutral, then obviously it's incredibly bad. Knight 6831, which dry dock is harder to make, regular or Patreon? Patreon, because it's longer. It's purely the length. Connor H, why were the Grand Bank schooners in service for so long? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And how does removing the bowsprit from a knockabout schooner improve safety for the crew? Not sure entirely. Bowsprits are a little bit of a fun thing to handle. They do require if you've got a bowsprit, you've probably got you've got a fully rigged ship, which requires a fairly complex degree of understanding of sails and rigging from the crew. I'm not that familiar with cargo going with Grand Bank schooners in detail, but in terms of improving safety, the main thing I can think is it's something that you don't less to poke ships and bridges and such like with, and it reduces the complexity of the rig, so that would be safer. But I offer that with a qualification of the most. I don't know a lot about the Grand Bank schooners other than they worked, so why not? Why bother changing that? Snapshot in history. Any good movie or film on the Battle of Trafalgar? I've seen a few, but none have really stood out. So, one last question. Captain Seafort, how likely is a recorded debate between you and Dr. Clark on battlecruiser-related issues? I've heard you have some interesting nuanced differences of opinion. If enough people want it, we'll do it. I mean, we get on pretty well. So, yeah, I mean, if enough people vote for it, I'm sure on one or the other of our discords, then yeah, well, someone will have to come up with a bunch of questions. Otherwise, we'll just end up talking about stuff we all agree on. So you'll have other people will have to come up with the questions to make sure it's on points we have some differences of opinion on. But I'm sure we'd both be happy to do it if there's enough demand. Yeah, so I will draw it to a close there. And with one last thing, Walter Broad US. Yeah, at some point I will cover the Royal Marines, the Royal Marines, the Dutch Marines, the various other Marines. That will be there. And Fushi Smith, are we ever going to see the dystopian wars fleets engage in a glorious battle? Yes, yes. Me and Mrs. Drac will engage in a big, furious dystopian wars fleet action at some point in the next few months. I'm just the next week's going to be very busy for me. I'm on a research trip, amongst other things. Then I've got a three-day reenactment event at Hever Castle over the August bank holiday weekend. So if you happen to be at Hever Castle, well, if you happen to be in the south of the UK and you want to visit Hever Castle over the bank holiday weekend, come and say hi. I'll be there in a full plate armour amongst other things. And then September's got Tank Fest in it, and potentially, depending on what happens with US-UK travel, maybe a trip to the States. If the trip to the States doesn't happen, I'll probably use that week to do a battle of dystopian wars with Mrs. Drac. Otherwise, we'll just have to see how it goes. But yes, it definitely will happen. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening. Now I will go and find some bats, even though my bat detector's gone AWOL, but I'm sure I can listen for them. My ears at least used to be that good. So see you all later, and have a good one.